Greetings, gamers, and welcome to the 50-second live stream from the Misfit Gamers Studios. I'm your host, Vortex, and this is D&D Discussions. On today's episode, we are going to be discussing oh, wow, I already messed that one up. I almost said cultivating. On today's episode, we are going to be discussing scaling mundane weapons. It is a old mechanic that has been kind of long since ditched in the rules as written, so we're going to kind of talk about where that went, or at least, when it was, what it is currently in terms of 5th edition and how they do the scaling, which is pretty much nothing. And then we're going to talk about some ideas about why we think that it is a missed opportunity, that they got rid of it, and what they can do to improve either the current status or even possibly bring it back. I do have Kage in the studio with me here today, so let me go ahead and bring him in. And I see we already have some people in chat, so welcome back on this Friday. Welcome.
What is happening, my friends? I am happy to be here on a wonderful Friday. It feels like the week just disappeared. I was telling Vortex about that before we started. I'm like, get the heck out of here. But, we're here. I'm excited. And I really like our topic today, too, because I hadn't honestly thought about it until we were talking on Monday, going over that homebrew review, and I was like, this has always been something that I struggled with, but I never actually thought about just homebrewing my own answer to this problem.
Exactly, and this is one of those, I don't want to say rare opportunities, but this is actually going to be a really good opportunity because this is going to be one of those times where we won't really necessarily have to officially homebrew anything. Do more about what I like to do, something like I like to do in High Point, which is, recognizing or at least looking at all of the additions not as replacements, but as expansions, right? And if you do that, then you can basically borrow mechanics when suitable. And this is one of those opportunities where I think 5th edition could benefit a lot from going just back in time and kind of readopting something it already has done in the past on 2nd edition, and with some minor tweaks of the rules as written. So I guess homebrewing a little bit. We can make it a little bit nicer, but we won't have to start from scratch. You know what I mean? And that's what I think what's really going to be interesting. But yeah, so as of right now, what is the main problem that we're talking about? So as it stands right now in 5th edition, you build this character, you have this build in mind, you can get perks, your physical aspects can get better, rarely, but sometimes you can get stat boosts, but for the most part, it's perks, it's feats, it's things that allow you to roll better when using things. But those things never change. Like, you start out as a rogue, you start out with 2 daggers. Those 2 daggers are going to do the same thing for the rest of the game. Now, you may be able to attack one more time per round, but after a couple levels, you may be able to use it differently. You may be able to throw it eventually, but it's still going to do the same amount of damage. And you're really not going to do a whole lot else with that, right? And it kind of doesn't really feel right. It doesn't feel like weapons really scale properly. It feels like the best thing you can do is replace them, and it feels like you want to be doing that constantly, and for me that feels very detached from the idea of most legendary warriors, heroes, fighters usually have a weapon that they've kept with them for years, for that whole thing, the family weapon. And the idea that in most gaming sessions I've seen, weapons are basically what is the most powerful attack to damage ratio I can get right now. You know what I mean? Because realistically, if I'm a fighter, if I can attack 3 times per round at my current level with my current feats and everything, all I really care about is, does the weapon have reach? What damage do I do? If it has any modifiers. But if you talk about base weapons, mundane weapons, right? What is it doing? It's literally, you're just picking the one that's going to do the most damage, because specifically speaking, it's not advantageous to say, hey, I'm a fighter and here's my backstory and it makes perfect sense I should use this weapon, when mechanically speaking, a much better weapon is standing right in front of you. And realistically speaking, it's like, why would you stick with the weaker weapon when you can use it? Your class says you can use that weapon just as proficiently as the weapon that you've had in your backstory, right? Why wouldn't you switch it? Like, you're not really incentivized to keep the lore weapon or the role play aspect of your character. And I find that disappointing. to say the least.
Yeah.
And I have other issues with this concept. I mean, I don't like breaking out of character in terms of like just swapping weapons whenever you find a better one that's more expensive and more damage. I don't like the idea of again, like I don't like the idea that you can't, like, it has to be magical for it to be held on to for very long. And the min-maxing concept, right? Like just constantly switching out weapons, or even in the middle of combat, right? Like one of my biggest like tack on issues with the way that 5e really works with weapon like specialties is if you have a certain weapon specialty, if you can, I forget what the thing I'm thinking of is, but like in your class, right? If you can have like finesse weapons,
right?
You can handle so many different categories of weapons in certain, when you have certain categories.
In 5th edition, it's actually pretty crazy. I think they only really have they have 2 real big categories. That's martial weapons and gosh, what's the other one? It was martial weapons and I think it's just really basic weapons, right? And then they have melee weapons and then they have ranged weapons. And it's going to be one of those 2. They're going to have one of those traits, right? And so it's either going to be a ranged weapon or it's going to be a melee weapon. It's either going to be a martial weapon or I'm going to look that mess up. Simple weapon.
Yeah,
That's what it was. It was a martial weapon or a simple weapon, right?
And I mean, and even going back to 2nd edition here too. I mean, it used to be even even less specific in terms of like proficiencies, right? So, melee weapons, light crossbow, heavy crossbow, thrown daggers, ranged weapons. There wasn't a lot of major categories either in terms of what you really had to, what you had to learn. You just basically could, like, again, in the middle of a fight, you could be fighting with a dagger and then
swap out to something else.
Just pick up a dagger and then pick up a long sword, a short sword, and then
dual wielding. Yeah,
and just constantly change what you're doing on the fly. And it's like, as cool as that sounds, when you think about it, if you've trained for years in a certain type of weapon, picking up another weapon, while you may in certain weapons may have familiarity, the idea that you're going to be equally proficient in all of these weapons throughout, like you've kept up with this all of your life, like that's just not how it works. I mean, even you, someone in the real world who has martial training, we've talked about this before. You've trained professionally for years, most of your life in bow staff. Giving you a javelin or a shorter spear will absolutely, you'll have a benefit than me, who has never fought with any of those type of weapons outside of roleplay, right? Like, not really. I've never done martial. So if you and I were to face off against any other opponent, you would have the advantage against that other opponent. Not just against me, but in that fight, you would have an advantage because you have bow staff experience and it's familiar, right? But in the same respect, if you've trained with a short sword your whole life, or even a long sword your whole life, you could make the argument that a dagger will feel somewhat familiar and you'll have better advantageous, you'll have a better advantage than someone who's never picked one up before. But going into a battle with someone who is proficient in the weapon they're wielding, it doesn't matter that you have an advantage over someone who's never touched the weapon, you still are at a disadvantage.
Very much so.
And that's one of the hardest things that I've always had with D&D in terms of I can use this type of weapon, so therefore here's the list of things that I'm allowed to use at will. And I don't know, I've always had a problem with that, just because, again, I like to gear my game a little bit more towards I don't want to say a realistic build, but I like a more customized, personal build, right? I want something that, like, if you're going to be the pirate and you're going to, like, master the cutlass, like, I want that to make sense, and I want that to be a character arc, right?
Yeah.
And I don't want you to say, oh, well, the cutlass no longer does enough damage, this weapon does better damage, and I can wield it. It kind of takes that away, right? So I've always struggled with how to better balance this. And I think today's topic is going to lead to something really great, because we were talking before stream and I kind of came to that revelation of a new adjustment I'm going to make to the way I do it in High Point. To make it better and to adjust or to address some of these issues that we have,
right,
in terms of the over specialization, but also recognizing that there is an argument to be made for recognizing if I've spent long enough in a type of weapon, other weapons of a similar type will be familiar, and I should have at least a leg up. And I can understand that argument.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's where I want to make the adjustment to high point. But I want to get primarily into the topic at hand first. We do have some chat going on. Cosmic's talking about his Wednesday
but he does mention something about his DM's house rule.
So let's see. So the black trick. Okay, so he's talking about the dragon. Some more of the situation that he was in. More about. Okay, so there's another. Okay, then there was a. Oh yeah, so he killed a bunch of dragons. And he's trying to tie that into how one of them could end up having cursed them by being Tiamat's
interesting.
Offering. And then so there's a DM house rule he talks about. So when making a melee attack, if the attacker rolls a nat 1, the target can use a reaction to make an opportunity attack. That's not a half bad house rule, actually.
I've seen that used a couple of times.
I've never actually played with it, but I've always felt that there's not enough crit fail opportunities. Like, you don't need to necessarily go overboard and like have the weapon break or fall out of your hand all the time, but a crit fail like that, having something to where if you're attacking someone and you crit miss, because again, we've talked about this before, where missing a roll doesn't mean you miss the target. It just means you don't do damage. You could hit their shield, you could bounce off that, you could hit them in the shoulder, it just glances off. It could be a parry.
Think about all the times that you're watching these shows, Star Wars, and they do that clash. No one's taking damage. It's still a very dramatic and intense moment, and it's still showcasing the skill set of the individual that's there.
Yeah. Or think about this, the choreography when they're actively sword fighting. All of those, if you think about it, if you watch Star Wars, all of those fights until someone dies, everybody's missing their attack rolls. If you think about a Star Wars lightsaber battle, the Jedi and the Sith, everybody's terrible at their attack rolls. If that was a D&D fight, they're literally all missing attack rolls.
That's really fair. And there might be a couple hits here. You might be able to get a little nick
when
here,
you see like that.
Get a little, but like,
but then again, you could. But here's the other argument too, because we've talked about this before, where HP doesn't necessarily always mean direct attack damage.
And that's fair.
Over time, however, even though all of those were blocks, you could make the argument that some of those were easy, right? They both attack and he just blocks with one side.
Imagine the one that like throws them back and they gotta like slide or whatever.
That's fatigue. That's making it harder for you to battle. If you have two people on you and you're having to, just because you're deflecting them, so it does mean that you're having over time a disadvantage in battle, right? So yeah, again, it all depends on how you look at AC. It all depends on how you look at HP and what those things mean. But again, failing an attack roll, I feel always like with a nat 1, I feel like that should be the one time where, at any other point, a miss or an attack, you can explain it in a lot of different ways. Hey, he comes in and you parry him away. You block him on your shield. He strikes you, but it glances off your armor, so you take no damage. You can explain a missed roll in so many different ways, but a nat 1, I feel like should always have something. And that's why I don't mind like crit table rolls where it's like roll a d6 and certain ones mean you'll actually do something really bad. Others mean nothing happens. But that right there, the idea that someone gets an opportunity attack on you, that's actually a really nice one. I like that.
Yeah.
I really think that's a good house roll. I think anybody could use that because again, nat 1 on an attack roll, you flubbed it so bad.
And it's great because it works both ways, and it's not super detrimental to like you in combat or anything like that. And
again, it doesn't even have to make your character look stupid. It doesn't have to be that you tripped and fell, or that you just like left your. It could be that you did a wide strike like that and missed him, and now because your arm's open, he just happens to have a wide open shot on you. Right? It doesn't mean that he's going to hit it. It just means he has an opportunity. And there's so many ways that can be cleverly used.
See, I
love breaking that into an opportunity attack. And then forgot exactly the way the second blue dried. I do remember spiked growth spell being confined.
I love
spiked growth in a confined space for a dragon is pretty bad. And then another party, animate object on boulders acting as living cover. That's actually pretty damn clever. That's like one of those like really clever uses of animate object is being able to make cover move with you. Like that's fast. Like I love good classic uses for things like that. It's those things that people look at a spell and they're like, well, how useful is that? Be like, well, have you ever wanted cover in battle? But if you've also wanted to move, solution. But it's one of those very rare ideas that you don't see a lot of people try because they'll just dismiss it as well, what does a spell really do? Like, it doesn't really help me do anything. And it's like, well,
right.
You got to have the right mind for it. But yeah, I really like that. But yeah, so with today's topic, when it comes down to mundane weapons, so the two ideal principles that I think that we're trying to tackle today, or at least discuss, are the fact that picking up a weapon at level 1, as of right now, 5e basically gives you no incentive to still be holding that same weapon at level 10.
And very much so. Shoot, doesn't give you any incentive to hold on to it for more than 5 seconds. The second anything better comes along,
exactly,
than any mundane weapon,
that's my thing. It's like yeah, and then there's the secondary, the knockoff effect of just too much specialization, right? You've made the argument before about we're supposed to be different, right? Adventurers are supposed to be a cut above the rest, but I still don't believe that means that a knight who trained to be a knight with a longsword and a shield and armor, or a cavalry person, is just as proficient with that as they are with the dagger and a bow and a short. You know what I mean? Like it just doesn't make sense that they're equally proficient to the same level. Minorly proficient in other weapons, I can totally justify, which we'll get into later. But yeah, that idea of that overall supremacy of these are all the weapons I get access to. These are the two issues that I think that I want to address. It's gonna do a little bit of callback to second edition and a little bit of homebrewing, but I think it'll be working for us. But yeah, those are my biggest like complaints with it is really I guess in 5th edition, like when it comes down to 5th edition, you get a couple feats that will give you an attack per round, but how often do you get an extra attack per round?
The biggest scaling that you get is specific to your class and your class alone. Paladins, monks, fighters get a bunch, but these are the only classes that get any increase to the number of attacks that they can do. Other than that, your weapon never increases in the amount of damage. So like when you increase the number of attacks, obviously your DPS is going to go up, right? You're able to do more damage per round, per turn, because you have more attacks. But think about, and this was my initial thought, it's like I'm thinking like cantrips. Cantrips are the melee attacks, or the base aspect, just like your mundane weapons are for a spellcaster, right? You got to spend your resources to cast the big spells, but this is just what's free. Swinging your sword is free, right? So this, and even for spellcasters, they get scalability with their cantrips as they go up in level, but it makes a lot more sense for that to be tied to their class than it does for these martial artists. Now, granted, you're going to be better at using the weapon, but as you level up in your class, because you're going to learn more, you're just going to get more tied to it. But again, like you said, having that be so across the board, like think about clerics. Clerics in 5th edition, they get almost every single weapon proficiency. Like they're proficient with everything. Now, the reality is no one cleric is going to be proficient with every weapon. Right. Like, it's just not going to, like, you're not going to be proficient unless that's your job. That's what you do. Unless that's what you have chosen to specialize in, is I am going to be the cleric that knows how to use every fucking weapon there is. Then it's not going to happen. So understanding, hey, this is what I've chosen to use to specialize to whatever. Like, I understand, like, at character creation, these are all of your available options, right? I understand if you're going to choose wizard, I'm not going to give you the option to choose a greatsword as your weapon, right? You can choose from like these ones, but whenever you choose that, that's the one you've chosen. That's the one you're good at. That's the one that you have the ability to use. If I'm a spellcaster and my focus is a crystal, an orb, I'd say similarly, you would have to put proficiency points to change your spellcasting focus to a tome or to a wand or to something else that you're gonna try and like adjust, you know. But if I'm a melee weapon user and I have a sword, you know? And I know this is a little pedantic because right now in 5th edition, there's no difference between a katana and I think a katana is basically just considered a long sword because it's versatile, right? Because you can use it with one hand or two hands.
Right,
But the reality is the way you're going to use the katana is very different than the way you're going to use a long sword. Is very different than the way you're going to use a great sword. Is very different than the way you're going to use a rapier, right? And so all of these weapons having all of these different skill sets required, like you said, there's room for overlap. You can do a little bit of this, you can do a little bit of that, but just being able to say, yo, I am now expert at this. I very much agree with you. I don't see it. Again, my initial thought was always to just scale it directly with your level. But I don't know. I think there's a better way to do it. And you and I have talked a little bit about what your thoughts are. And I think it's because I don't do what you do with 2nd edition and proficiency points. I think it's the only reason why I wouldn't use that system in my world.
Yeah.
But I do think that there is some, like, what I want to do is I genuinely want to recategorize the weapons in 5th edition. Right now, they're just categorized as martial and simple. I'm going to throw those out the window, and, you know, we're going to have bladed weapons, we're going to have blunt weapons. Like, I'll figure out, like, what kind of categories I want to have, but, like, I'm going to change the categories, and those are the categories you'll be able to choose from.
Right.
And again, things in those categories will be much easier for you to use than things outside of that category, you know, but, you know,
No, and I get you too, and that's where I have the 2nd edition rules just to kind of like go off the mind, because obviously I've made some modifications for high point over the years, and I think a lot of the specifics too are influenced from my days with my old DM,
right?
Probably inadvertently, because I don't remember the specifics. I don't have anything notes from back then, but I can't not assume that I've had probably a lot of like hidden memories come into play about this.
For sure.
So, I assume that my modifications probably aren't my own in this one, but at the same time, they are the best that I can come up with, and it's just,
and
it's an
as usual, whatever it is that you ended up with is what makes sense for your world.
And what makes sense for me, and over the times, over the years, it's the same idea I keep coming back to, whether or not it was inspired or not. But yeah. When it comes down to like one of the other reasons why I like 2nd edition is one of the ways that they do weapons, right? Because in 2nd edition we do proficiency points, and essentially when you create your first character in 2nd edition, you get a set number of proficiency points for weapons and non-weapon proficiency points for skills. And you initially, you choose how many proficiency points to put into what weapons you want to use. Now, in 2nd edition, typically what they're looking for is, like, for instance, a fighter or a warrior back then, initially got 4 weapon proficiency points, right? And the idea is that once you became proficient in
does it vary based upon your class?
Yes. So, like, a fighter would get 4, and then he gets 1 per every 3 levels. A wizard starts with 1 and gets 1 every 6 levels. A priest starts with 2 and gets 1 every 4 levels. And a rogue starts with 2 and gets 1 every 4 levels.
Does a weapon proficiency count as something like your spellcasting focus, like your orb or your tome? Is that a weapon proficiency, or is that different?
No. The weapon proficiency is an experience point or a skill point that you can spend.
But what I mean is, I could use a weapon proficiency on something like a sword?
Yes.
Or something like a staff? Mm-hmm. Could I also use a weapon proficiency on something like a tome? Or something like a crystal ball, or something like a wand.
Not in the rules as written. No.
So it would be a different type of proficiency point in those things.
Well, because those don't do anything directly. So those would, like, a tome is just like what you would use as your spellcasting focus, but the spell would decide how strong it is. The tome, the spellcasting focus doesn't decide anything about how powerful something is by rules as written.
Interesting. Okay.
So in this particular case, like, right, so the idea is that the way second edition does it is each class has a list of weapons they can become proficient in. So this is where it makes sense, right? So a fighter has a much larger list of things that they can learn. Not necessarily like in 5th edition where you can just have any of these and pick it up and you're doing it. It's more of a, if you're this class, here's the types of weapons that would be available for your history, for your past, your background, and all of that, and for your knowledge base. Then within that list of weapons, you assign your proficiency points. So you say, hey, I want to learn these 4, as a fighter, these are the 4 weapons I want to be proficient in that I'm allowed to learn. Now, beyond that, once you have a proficiency in a weapon, it's then based off of your character's level. So for a fighter, let's say you have a melee weapon, short sword, right? You put one of your proficiency points in it. Between level 1 and 6, you get 3 attacks every 2 rounds. So one round you get 1 attack, the next round you get 2 attacks, and in either order, right? Once you're at level 7 to 12, you get 2 attacks per round. And then level 13 and beyond, you get 5 attacks every 2 rounds. Split up however you want. Gotcha. So like 4 and 1, 3 and 2. It's mainly designed to be split evenly, but you get the idea. The idea is that as you've leveled up in the weapon that you're proficient in, you've learned to use it better. You've learned to be able to make more strikes. You've learned to be able to do things with it. And that's pretty much where it ends with that. Now, they do have an additional optional rule for fighters where you get weapon specialization, where it essentially, if you want to become specialized in a weapon, you can't multi-class, so you have to stay a fighter. But as long as it's a weapon that you're proficient in, you can choose that weapon to become specialized in, and then you get an additional +1 to like those stats.
Got you.
So that's rules as written 2nd edition. And I like it. It's pretty clean. It's the foundation of what I like to use. But this is where we start to detour from High Point, right? But before we do that, I want to just make the note. This is where I really think personally 5th edition, I guess I say 5th edition, but it's not like 5th edition is going to change, right? The next level of D&D, right? Because 5th edition wouldn't change a core rule book. It would be like the next edition of D&D.
Well, I think even you posted in our Discord, there was some updates to the 5th edition way that they do some of their core rules. Like, I know they've revamped the monk class. They revamped the ranger class.
Oh, that's right.
You know, like, so there are additions, addendums, and adjustments that they make on occasion to different things.
There's occasion, but I don't think they would change like a rule set like this. I think this would be like a new addition to
and that
D&D.
Might be fair, especially because this is pretty.
But taking a cue off of this idea that not necessarily maybe the weapon proficiencies, but the idea that the weapons you select early on become better and easier to use as you level up. I think that cleanly, for a wider audience, is probably the way to go. Because then, you know, the idea that you can select a handful of weapons that at any point you can switch between. So early on, you could say, hey, I like this idea of being a rogue. I'm going to use daggers early on, but I do eventually want to use this other weapon. And so knowing that you can kind of pre-select these certain categories that throughout your time, no matter which one you're using, they'll all kind of be your better weapons to choose from. I do like that, because it's like, hey, here are all the weapons you can use, but select a few, and those are the ones you will be able to use. I like it. It's clean. It's not what I use specifically for High Point, because I wanted to lean a little bit more into this. I really liked the idea of weapon specialization, getting the +1, but it's only attributed to fighters in rules as written.
Right, okay.
So with High Point, I've taken it a step further, and I've essentially leaned heavier into weapon specialization. So as it stands in High Point, instead of the weapons leveling up with you in terms of like 1 through 6 level is a certain attacks per round, and then 7 through 12 it's a different attacks per round, I have it, and again, this is where I'm pretty sure I have a heavy influence from my old DM. I have it to where every proficiency point that you put into the weapon ups its abilities, regardless of your level.
Okay.
So you put, right now, if you were to put a proficiency point into dagger, you would get 3 attacks every 2 rounds, as rules is written 2nd edition. And that will not change until you reach 7th level. And that weapon will always be that same damage. So it only behooves you to get a better dagger. and level up with a dagger. So in high point, I wanted this to feel different, right? Because I think you were going to allude to this earlier, but you didn't quite hit on it, so I was waiting for you to say it. One of the other issues that I have with this static idea that a weapon's damage is a weapon's damage is a weapon's damage, I think the downside to that mentality is it doesn't take into account your proficiency with knowing how to properly implement it on the human body. Not just in a fight, how to get past someone's guard. It's one thing to know how to sword fight, and you can attest to this with kendo or bow staff or the bow staff. Either one is, it's one thing to learn how to get through someone's guard. It's another to get through a guard and land a hit. And it's another to get through a guard and land a proper hit that's going to net you the amount of points or a kill blow. Like, using a bow staff, the first thing you need to do is learn how to control it so you don't hit yourself, learn how to defend yourself, then learn how to get through someone's defenses. But once you get through their defenses, that's great. But are you hitting them on the shoulder? Are you hitting them on the wrist? Are you hitting them in the head? Are you hitting them in the groin? What are you doing once you break the defense? I'm assuming that as you learn early on, like when I did with kendo, you just go for the easiest shot. I'm through defenses, just do damage. Just get the hit in. But over time, you learn techniques of, well, now that I've broken the guard, what are all the spots I can hit and what's the most advantageous? Not just for the point, but hey, I know they're right-handed. If I can hit either shoulder, go for the right shoulder. It's going to make them be weaker throughout the match, right? Mm-hmm. Same thing in a battle. If you know someone has a gimp leg or a disability, you're going to go for that leg in order to make the battle harder for them over time, right? And that's what I think it doesn't really attribute anything to, is your understanding of not just how to fight with the weapon, but to apply it properly for damage. So in high point, every proficiency point not only increases the attacks per round, but it also the attacks per round, but I also increase to hit and to damage bonuses. All of this increases every proficiency point, because the idea of a proficiency point is the amount of time you've spent mastering this weapon. So I have a broader range. It basically starts one proficiency in high point. I should have this. I should just bring it out, but it's all buried. But basically, the rundown is, if you put a single proficiency point in a weapon, you'll get one attack per round with it. You're proficient in it. It's bare bones. You'll get one attack per round, and no bonuses, and it's basic damage.
Right.
But every time you pump a thing into it, something's going to go up. So the first thing that goes up is attacks per round. You're going to go from the one attack per round to a 3-2. So you're automatically going to get one extra attack every other round. And then I think it's... so let's see. So it's 0... Hold on. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. And then fifth level is 1 and 1. Yeah. So you put one proficiency point in, and then you also get a +1 to attack. So I give you an actual bonus to attacking with it. When you get 3 proficiency points, you now have 2 attacks per round. So you see the attacks per round is just going up by 1 tick. Not per round, but
every other round. Yeah.
So you're going to have 2 attacks per round with 3 proficiency points. You're going to have a +1 to hit, and you're going to have a +1 to damage now. Just on top of the weapon's attack roll.
Right.
Because the idea is that you're getting better implementing. And then again...
So it first starts with just a +1 to hit, and then by the time you hit 3, you get a +1 to hit, and then a +1 to damage.
And then at the 4th proficiency point, it's now another. It's now the 5-2, so 5 attacks for every 2 rounds. Mm-hmm. And then you have, that would be and then you have now a +2 to hit, +1 to damage, and then at a 5th proficiency point, considered the master level, it would be 3 attacks per round. It goes, finally up to 3 attacks per round, and a +2 to hit, +2 to damage. So this is all the same weapon that you started with. So at level 1 character, you get, in 2nd edition, you get 4 proficiency points. So you could put all 4 into the dagger. Right. Well, I have a home rule.
If you switch weapons, as long as it's the same weapons type, as long as it's another dagger.
Yep. All of it applies.
It's still Gucci.
And that's the thing, is so you are incentivized. Trying to incentivize the idea of you can hold on to the weapon you started with and really only change it out if it gets more magical, right? Like, you can do that thing. And again, in high point, you can make weapons magical. You can do things to it. But I do have a home rule, just because I don't want a level 1 character being nearly a master You know what I mean? At something, because that would just not make much sense. So I do have a rule that starting your character, when you make your build, you do have to take at least 2 weapons. Every character build, you have to start with 2 weapon proficiencies or two weapons. Right. And the reason is I do that for a couple of reasons. One, it's so you don't start as a level 1 being nearly a master at a weapon. It just doesn't make any sense. And 2, it's to really make sure people like don't accidentally like min-max out into a bad build, because you can accidentally min-max out.
Or pigeonhole yourself to a place where you... Imagine if you don't have any proficiencies in any ranged weapons.
That's
you only have weapons.
And so forcing 2 weapons, my suggestion is at least take 1 ranged weapon. At least take, even if you never put another proficiency in range, if you even if you're like, I don't want range, I just want to do just this. I'm like, you have to choose 2 weapons, maybe a hand crossbow, maybe a short bow, just to be able to pick it up. You know what I mean? Like, but if they don't want to, it's just to spread out those proficiencies, because they'll need to at least burn 1. So the max you can start out with is 3 proficiencies in a weapon. But that way, because the way that you rank up, right? So in 2nd edition, like a fighter, you're going to start out with 4 weapon proficiencies, but you have to have at least 2 weapons start out. So the best you can put in is 3 into a single weapon, which still makes sense for a fighter, right? Still makes sense, because a fighter is the only one that gets so many. Everybody else, a wizard only starts with 1. The priests and the rogue, the clerics and rogue classes, and all of the thieves, they only start out with 2. So they all have to start out with 2 weapons anyway. The fighter's the only one that can even get close to mastering a weapon, so he gets 3 proficiencies.
Yeah.
So there's more balance. And then it's 1 every 3 levels. So
for
the fighter. So once he reaches 3rd level, boom, 4th proficiency point. Once he reaches 6th level, boom, he can become a master at the weapon. That's not that bad. I don't think that's waiting until 6th level. And you think about it.
Now,
remember,
I do recall there being other ways to gain proficiency points.
Oh yeah. Like the idea of proficiencies is that's just I still follow the rule structure or the book structure of how they level up, but there are other things you can do. Like, you know, there's backstory reasons why you could start with more, or in game you could justify how you learn more. Like if you find a very, very special NPC who's offering to train you for something very special. Wow. Thanks, Stream Elements. Took you that long to say that we were live. Appreciate you.
Rude.
But you know what I mean? Like the idea is, yes, there are plenty of different ways that you could get proficiency points outside of leveling up. But if you don't, by level 6, because remember, in 2nd edition, you had to wait till level 7. You had to be a level 7 before you went from a 3-2 attack to a 2 attacks per round. But in High Point,
right,
by level 6, you can be a master class. You could literally master a weapon. 3 attacks per round, plus 2 to hit, plus 2 to damage with your starter weapon by level 6. I think that justifies, because then remember, because again, here's the reason why. You got to remember, especially back in 2nd edition, the idea of a 10th level character, 10th level, because remember, I hate the idea that a level 1 character is already an established anything. Doesn't make any sense to me. I like the idea of 2nd edition, because 10th level meant you were a named person. Like the idea was people knew you. You had, by the 10th level, you had a reputation, which is why you were able to get followers.
Does that mean that every 10th level person has to have a reputation? Like, you won't be able to get to 10th level without a reputation?
No, it's not something that you have to build. But mechanically speaking, at 10th level, you're allowed to gain followers in 2nd edition.
Right.
So fighters can gain other fighters. Rogue can start like a thieving like guild. But basically, you're so well known. You've gotten to 10th level. You've done enough things. Your name is spread around that people know your name and like, hey, I want to learn from you, bro. Like, you're awesome. I please teach me. And that's why you can start. You can like start a stronghold. You can start things where you gather followers, and you can either have them travel with you, or you can make them work for you and make money off of them. There's a lot of different behind the scenes things that 2nd edition does, but it starts at 10th level. So if you extrapolate, well, what is it going to take? Like if you think about, let's say it's a level per gaming session, right? Like let's talk about like those larger 6, 8 hour, 10 hour gaming sessions.
Right.
Every session is an accomplishment, and every time you're going to level up, every 1 or 2 gaming sessions, right? Well, if you think about what does it take to get known by level 10, think about what it's going to take, you know, to really get known, right? You have to save some people. You have to do some deeds, kill some things, go kill a dragon, go save a princess.
Right.
So by level 6, you've tested the ropes, kind of know what you're doing. You could master a weapon and still have 4 levels to finally go, not only did I master a weapon, but then look what I did with it. So to me, it makes more sense that by level 6 or 7-ish, you should be able to be that strong, because by that time, now you're using that strength to build that reputation at 10th level. So by 10th level, instead of the idea that at 10th level, you're now suddenly strong and suddenly people want to follow you, it's more like it took you a couple years being strong, or, you know, it took you months of being strong at level 6 to 10 to work up to people knowing, oh my God, you're not just strong, but you did this XYZ thing, right?
Right.
Because you don't just follow someone who does a good deed. You don't just say, like, that guy ran into a burning building and saved a bunch of kids. He's my... dude, I need to learn from this guy. I need to learn how to jump into dead buildings. I need to know how to jump into burning buildings, right? You don't do that. But if you say that same guy, and he goes from that to stopping a bank robbery to basically taking a bullet for you, or like someone tries to stab you and, you know, he has armor, like basically the Batman concept of you see him enough and you're gonna be like, oh wow. So you're not just like right place, right time, and you're not just a good Samaritan. Like, you are someone I aspire to be, because you do so many good things. And that's why, for me, it justifies why by 6th level, and again, that's only on this build, right? That's only if you built it to master a single weapon by 6th level. But that justifies by 10th level, you having that kind of power. You know what I mean? As that early on. And even if you don't, even if you specialize and spread it out, that still justifies by 10th level. You know, you don't have to be specialized in mastering a weapon to gain that kind of notoriety. But for those wondering why is it balanced to be so powerful, I mean, again, it's only a +2 to hit and a +2 to damage. Even at level 6, a +2 to damage isn't doing that much on a dagger that's doing a D4. Or even if you get a dagger that's doing a D6, it's not changing the die. It's only adding a few extra points to the end of that, right?
Yeah.
So again, that broadsword that's doing a D8 is still only doing a D8 +2. At level 6, that sounds great. Once you get to level 10, that +2 is doing fucking nothing in the background. But what's really clutch is that +2 to hit.
That for sure.
The +2 to damage is just there in the background to help justify how it levels up, because it goes back and forth. Otherwise, it would look like nothing happens, +1 to hit, nothing happens, +1 to hit, +2 to hit. It just feels weird to level it up that way, but if you alternate, it makes a lot more sense where they both get up to 2. So it's just one of those things where early on, those little pluses to damage matter. And again, it encourages early level specialization. It encourages you to specialize in a weapon instead of just have one of each, because you're going to get the plus to hit, plus to damage early, but the plus to hit's always going to be the long-term benefactor. And that's why I like this system. I really find this system pretty clean. My standard system goes up to 5, and then I do allow for a sixth option, but that takes in-game work. You can't just do it. Because typically what I say is that the idea is that, you know, every time you level up, you find someone who can train you, right? So levels 1 through 4, or proficiencies 1 through 4, are pretty easy to just, any town will have them. If someone wanted to level up and put a proficiency point in a weapon up to level 5, and they're in the middle of bumfuck nowhere, they're not leveling that level up. I will make them wait.
Right.
Like if you're dungeon delving, and in the middle of the dungeon delve, you guys level up.
You get enough experience to level up.
You're not getting to spend your proficiencies. Like, that is the kind of DM I am. You don't get to spend your proficiencies, because, like, again, I'm not as harsh as second edition Rules as Written, because Rules as Written in second edition has time frames. You actually have to spend in-game time doing things. I assume that's happening in 2 different ways. Part and partial, the break time, couple days, doing some things. But I also allow for, as long as you're sticking with your character build, and this is where it depends, right? If you want to kind of like left field your character out of nowhere and be like, hey, by the way, this level up, I'm doing something that's out of character, there might be more limitations.
Right.
But if it's the standard, hey, I'm just putting the proficiency in the same weapon I've been using, I look at it as you've been training this whole time.
Very much
You're just finally, you've been practicing, not in real battles because you don't want to fuck up, right? You don't test something in a battle. But let's say you've been like, I think I think I can get another attack on these guys. Like if I parry him and slide my hand, I'll bet I can get another attack. So the entire time when you're not in real battles, all your downtime, all your nighttime, you and your buddies, your party are practicing, they're sparring, and you're practicing this move over and over, and you're getting close. But it's not until you level up, aka you do it one night and you're like, oh no, I got this. I can do this confidently. Now I'm willing to do it in battle, knowing I can't. Because my mentality is, why say, hey, you have to spend 2 weeks in game leveling up? Oh, but in game story wise, you only have 3 days to rescue the princess. Sucks to be you guys. You're going to get stuck at this low level for this higher level.
Yeah.
It's boring. It makes no sense. I understand why they did it campaign wise and storybook wise, but I blend the difference. I think that if it's a standard level up and you're going in the same direction you've always been, most of that can be assumed has been happening in the background, has been happening as you've been training, not in real fights. Right. You're not going to test something you're not confident in doing in a real fight, because what will happen, you might mess up and it could cost you your life.
It could be very dangerous for you or your
like in a sparring match, if you're learning a back, like a back kick or like a backflip kick for the first time, you're not going to test it in a tournament. You're going to wait until you're like, no, now's the moment. I know I can pull it off.
I've pulled that off 100 times in practice over and over again. I've had somebody intentionally try to kick me out. I've done all of the controlled scenarios before I am in a realistic situation.
And that's why I like this idea that I don't punish people for the time frames. Like if the story is going to be like, hey, you have 24 hours, but you guys are leveling up.
Right.
As long as it's within reason. But like, let's say you want to suddenly go out of nowhere at a left field and just say, hey, I'm doing something that doesn't, and you've never mentioned it before. Like it's not, because again, you know me, I'll do the things where if you mention it and be like, hey, I'm working up to this, we'll fudge some numbers. But that's my thing. It's that whole, I don't like the idea that you're in the middle of nowhere and suddenly you just naturally can do something better. Right. So that's where I think you have to just play it right as a DM, right? Whether or not you want to allow a level up in the moment and it just happens, or do you actually have to have it like at a proper rest? And so part of the reason, going back to what I was saying, is with the proficiency points, it's mostly understood that anywhere in general, you're going to be able to find someone that can train you how to be slightly better, and you've been slightly getting better over time. But once you get to that 5th proficiency point and you're a master at a weapon, going to that 6th proficiency is not a I'm just leveling up kind of thing.
Yeah.
You need their weapon proficiency to do it, but you also need the in-game justification. You need to find someone who is better at it.
It's something that needs to be adventured to occur.
So yeah, so that is the way that I do it in High Point, because I feel that it encourages specialization. It allows for people to have multiple options. But I did say that there's going to be a modification to this earlier, because you, before stream, brought these ideas to me. And while this solves a lot of problems that I've had with how weapon specialization happens in D&D, it doesn't solve the argument that you've had, where if I'm using a bow staff and I pick up a spear, why is it literally like I have no fucking clue what I'm doing? Like, you picking up that spear shouldn't be confusing. But at the same time, my argument is, but you shouldn't also be equally as good against the same opponent you were just fighting. Like, if you're fighting an opponent with a bow staff and you drop that, pick up a spear,
should I be able to have those same 2 attacks per round that I just had?
But I also don't think that you should have a disadvantage at attack. Yeah. Now, granted, if you went from a bow staff to a dagger, So with that, my system doesn't solve that. My system still only solves specific weapons and doesn't really solve the bleed over effect of, but this weapon is similar. So with that in mind, I am going to make a small modification to the way High Point works with this. Moving forward, starting today, I'm going to keep the exact way I do weapon proficiencies with High Point, right? 1 point per weapon. It's going to progress the same way. But what I'm going to allow now is that for every 3rd proficiency in a weapon, and I don't know if this will be stackable, but once you reach essentially a 3rd proficiency point in a certain type of weapon, all weapons of a similar type will immediately you'll gain a single proficiency in all of those similar weapons. So like normally right now in High Point, if you put a single point into short sword, you know how to use a short sword. You pick up a dagger or a long sword, you're not proficient in it. So you actually get negatives to your roll. You put 2 points into short sword, now you get an extra attack every other round. Extra point to hit, but not to damage. Dagger, longsword, still nothing for you. Put that third proficiency point in that short sword. Dagger and longsword you automatically have on your list as 1 proficiency point because they're directly related to the weapon. And that's the idea that if you put your proficiency weapon down, but you pick up a weapon that's similar, you're not negative at it, but you're not as good as you are with your weapon. So that's my solution. Is you still have to specialize in a weapon, but once you've gotten to that third proficiency where you're more than comfortable with it, you're not just proficient, you're not just able to hold it, but you're really able to start using it, and not quite a master yet, but really able to use it, other weapons of similar types now don't suffer a penalty. And I think that makes sense, because again, a bow staff, you could be 3 proficiency points into a bow staff.
So I would ask this, if this makes enough sense to you. It's a very light adjustment to what you just said. And basically all it is so instead of, because I do believe that at a certain point, like it's not, when you are progressing, like you have to get like exponentially better at what you're doing. Now, granted, it's slightly easier for you to do so, but the gap between the differences gets smaller. And so what I would say would be something like this. It's like the first 3, you get 1. But then once you get to 5, you get 1 more. So now you're at 2. And then if you so happen to do all the things necessary to get to a 6th, then you can basically say, all right, now, because think about how good you have to be to get that 6th one.
But this is why I'm choosing 3, because this is where 3 would give you a base proficiency in all similar weapons, which is already a boon, because you could make an argument for what's a similar weapon. A bow staff, okay, javelin, spear, but a short sword.
But are you calling this categories, or is it going to be based upon the argument given?
I think it's more of a, instead of trying to categorize and make all these lists, I think it's just going to be what's justifiable. If you're proficient in a bow staff, a javelin is just a little bit shorter, but same concept. It's not designed to be used as like a bow staff, but I also don't think that you won't be proficient in ranged, but you can still throw it. You can still wield it. If you got a short spear, not like a cavalry spear, but if you got a regular spear, you could still wield it, because bow staff, you train to fight similarly. But
especially Chinese bow staff.
The difference is, though, is you aren't trained to use a pointed tip. You're trained with the same techniques, but you've not trained with a pointed tip for the pointed tip.
And I will say, because there are some techniques that, and this is something I had to learn the hard way just throughout my own personal training, but like trying to do something with like one weapon and thinking another weapon's going to allow you to do it, because there's lots of moves that I do with bow staffs that require you to bend it. And you have a bamboo staff that can handle that type of flexibility. Not all these other weapons are going to be able to do that. You try to do that with some of these like other spears or javelins.
If you go from rattan to a non-cured bamboo, you'll snap the bamboo before the rattan. So and the same thing too. Like a bastard sword is very, very similar to a short sword, right? And you could say bastard sword, long sword, short sword. Several of these are, even a falchion, are all very similar. Scimitar is very similar, and picking it up, but they all have a different fighting style for the different designs and for their application. And this is where, again, we don't want to get
the weight of these different swords just alone.
And it's not so much saying that D&D needs to be more realistic, right? We don't necessarily that we're trying to make it realistic, but from the same concept of, I still want it to make sense, and I still want it to be believable from the character. Like playing the character, I want the character to make sense. So that's where I think 3 makes sense, because the argument in High Point would be, does it make sense for both of us to say this weapon is similar enough that you'll get a proficiency for it, right? It's like there'll be a couple categories of like, here's the obvious ones, and then we'll talk about anything that you pick up later. But then the idea is, if you get to the 6th, if you finally get to that, I've mastered this weapon beyond a master. I have pushed myself beyond the standard mastery of this weapon, that to me means you've now unlocked much more understanding of any type of weapon like this. Because again, a master at a weapon is still just a master at that weapon. But going one step beyond requires creativity, requires using the weapon slightly out of its normal. Because again, I look at that as you're not becoming a known master. You're not becoming the master that everyone thinks of. You're becoming something so far beyond that, right? It's like Bruce Lee creating his own, martial art because he was so good at what he did and what everyone else taught him.
There are plenty of masters out there that don't even touch.
So
Bruce
you can even create. So maybe
status.
you could even consider it like that: is when you get that 6th proficiency point, you're essentially creating your own martial art with that weapon. It's a personal martial art that only you understand because you've elevated it.
I mean, you obviously could teach other people, sure.
And that's why I believe that makes more sense that at that level, any similar weapon now gets a 2nd proficiency point. Remember, these are free. So it's like if you were training with the short sword and got a free proficiency of long sword.
No, I get it.
And
I was just thinking
another free one.
When I think about how good would I be? How good do I genuinely think I would be with these other weapons if I got to the point you're describing with this 6th?
Yeah.
If I got to, we'll say, Bruce Lee status.
Yeah.
How good would I be? In my mind, it feels like it would be more than 2 proficiency points, which is why
But it's 2 proficiency points, assuming you have never touched. Remember, this is from 0, so it means that you have trained. Like you could literally be shut off from the world.
I get that, but I mean,
but the moment you pick this weapon up, it's intuitive
because it's so similar. So a lot of those
you and I have had this conversation.
Transfer, and that's just the mindset that my head is going towards.
But I agree. But that's where again, because by level 6 you can have 5 proficiency points. So by level 6, having 5 proficiencies in one weapon and then 2
in all the others
for free.
That's do understand, especially when we're looking at I was thinking about this a second ago. A lot of what we're doing is we're trying our best to make this as least cumbersome as possible while
palatable.
Adding. What's that?
Palatable to everyone.
Yes, and so that we can prevent things from being able to be abused in a way that is unnecessary, right?
Well, and also be able to be taken and adjusted for other, like obviously I'm going to do something differently than you are, but what we're trying to do is come to that even ground where we can accept a foundation.
Yes.
That then we'll split apart from. Because it's
and everyone does. Everyone's got their flavor that they add to whatever details that they want.
But I think we're on the same page in the sense that I prefer the individual weapon customization, the specialization that comes with 2nd edition. I just think it falls short in both really showing off what that specialization means. So it doesn't really give you enough per level. Like I think the proficiency point's more important. Because what 2nd edition basic does is says, hey, you get proficiency points every so many levels, which means that as you level up, those individual weapons will become better and easier to use, which means all we're encouraging you to do, which think about this from the point of view of a warrior, right? A knight. Pick any type of fighter. Take them in their weapon, a monk with his staff. And you're telling him, hey, as you level up, you're going to get better with that staff automatically. But you're also going to have the ability to learn other weapons. I know that you've mastered the staff your whole life. I know the staff is your weapon. And you'll get better with it. But you can constantly just add weapons. So, and also think about this. At 12th level, you get another proficiency point. So, you've never touched a dagger in your life. But you're like, fuck it. I'm going to be proficient in dagger now.
So, here's the thing that I was thinking about. Because I understand the mindset. But I almost feel, and I know this... I almost feel that those other proficiency points should be what I would call phantom proficiency points. What I mean is you don't actually have proficiency in them, but like say if you wanted to like actually train in one of those other things and I actually wanted to get proficient, if I put a proficiency point in there, it would be 1 proficiency point because now I'm actually training and I'm starting at the beginning. Now I might be able to like train faster in it, but like it's a phantom one. So it's not like, hey, if I get another proficiency point, I add it on top of the other 2 that I have now. I have 3, and that's the first proficiency point I've actually put in there, because the others I just had from it. I still feel like it might be warranted to build up to it, but just it's like in those situations where you're on the fly and you're like, oh my gosh, I need this, I have this, you drop this. This is how good I would be able to be at it. You know?
Yeah, and again, I don't like thinking of too specifically like that, because I think those calls are better. Like, that's one of the things I have with some of the D&D rules, is there's some rules that are out there that are so specific, like so situational, where I'm just like, why did this have to be a situational rule? Why can't we just have said DA discretion, right? And that's why, you know, it's like, because this is one of the issues that I take with like 2nd edition, right? Because again, just because it's my foundation doesn't mean I don't have problems with it.
Of course.
So in 2nd edition, at 7th level, I now suddenly get more attacks per round with whatever weapon I'm proficient in. And then at 12th level, I get even more proficient. So, right? So by 12th level, 3 attacks per round is what the book's given me, right? Mm-hmm. I'm getting 3 attacks per round because it's 12th level. But I also gained a proficiency point this level. So you're telling me I've never touched a dagger my entire gaming career. My entire character's life has never touched a dagger. I've only ever used short sword, long sword, bastard sword, bow, whatever. All those are all my proficiency points. And now suddenly I get this new proficiency point. I'm going to put it in dagger. I've never even touched a dagger before. I suddenly, because I'm 12th level, I instantly get 3 attacks per round because I'm 12th level with a proficiency in dagger for the first time in my life. How? Like, that's what D&D by the book would say. Is your 12th level, here's a proficiency point, and by the way, anything you're proficient in, you get 3 attacks per round. So if I've never touched this weapon, but I'm spending a proficiency point to suddenly be proficient in dagger, but because I'm 12th level, day 1 touching this dagger, I get 3 attacks per round. Whereas this short sword I've been carrying my whole fucking life, it's taken me 10 levels to get here. I had to wait till 12 levels.
I had to do all that work.
But dagger, day 1, pick it up. That's my problem with that mindset of, and that's where, like you were saying, like the phantom concept of that. I don't mind the idea of a knockoff proficiency point, because the way that I wish I had my write out because I actually have it written better, but each proficiency level, each point you put in is a named state. I have a title for it, like proficient, skilled. Right. And each one, the name represents, like being skilled with it means that you're better than the average, but you can only do so much. And that's where I do like that idea of having the knock-on effect, because again, the idea that you've trained so well with one weapon immediately gives you an automatic proficiency. Again, just means you get 1 attack per round. Doesn't mean you can do anything fancy, but it means you can hold your own. It means that you're not at a penalty. It means that you're not going to have a disadvantage on your attacks. You're not going to have less damage, because by the book, with 2nd edition, there are negatives if you aren't proficient, and it's basically like a negative to your rolls. I think so. It's like for fighters, it's a -2, and then for everyone else, it's like a -3 or 4. So like if a dagger, if you're not proficient in a dagger, it's actually like a -2 to damage. So it's a 1d4 minus 2.
That's crazy. To your damage, not your attack?
Both. It's the whole thing. It's like you get a -2 to your rolls. So your attack. And so that's why I kind of like that idea of the knock-on effect of removing that penalty to, like, you know, to similar weapons. I do like that, and that's why I want to add that to High Point. You made a really good argument about that, because I've never addressed that, and I've always known I didn't address that because I didn't know how. But that right there, I mean, you guys saw it live. High Point changes in the moment. But that's literally something we only had talked about today. We have not talked about it before today. And it was right before stream that I made that decision. But yeah, I like that idea of having this knock-on effect that I've gotten so good at this weapon that similar types of weapons I do not need to. And the idea too, remember, because the proficiency point, the way I explain it in High Point, is that it's also an accumulation of what you've been practicing on the side. So if you've never touched these weapons before, instead of saying, well, yes, you're now 3 proficiency points in short sword, so we're going to say that you've secretly been training with dagger. Right. No, that's the natural attunement that you have, that you pick up a dagger and you're like, okay, I get this enough. I feel it. Yeah. And that's what you're talking about, right? It's the idea of how good would I be? That's why the proficiency point matters, is because it's not just taking away a negative, but it's also implementing the idea of, It's without knowledge, without training, just instantaneously I can pick this up and go, that's similar enough. I know what I'm doing. Again, you're not going to be a master at battle. You're not going to go win a tournament with it. But a thug gets you on a street, you're not going to fumble.
I will be honest. Like, I do genuinely feel like my concept of like even real world scaling is skewed just because my perception, my perspective may have come from, you know, certain things while on one side are much, much harder for me to accomplish. Other things are much, much easier. And so I know that there's a balance to be had when it comes to, hey, how much does this actually overlap, generally speaking? Like, how much is it actually going to help?
That's why I would allow the arguments to be made. Like, there will be some obvious ones. You know, like I would say this, like that knock-on effect wouldn't apply to range. Like normally in second edition, you actually have to apply a different proficiency point to a dagger if you want to be able to use it as a ranged weapon. So a dagger needs a proficiency point in melee and a proficiency point in range in order for you to use it fully and wholly. So this knock-on effect, if you get 3 points in sword, maybe you only get 1 proficiency in melee dagger. Doesn't automatically give you the full dagger proficiency.
Interesting.
Because then you could make that argument, right? You only get the proficiencies that make sense for that thing. So like, let's say you train in bow staff and pick up a javelin. You cannot throw that javelin and get the javelin benefits of it being thrown, but you can use it like a short spear and be proficient in melee combat. But vice versa, if you have trained in a javelin and pick up a bow staff, you might not be great at finagling it, but you can throw it like a motherfucker. Like, it may not do piercing damage, but it will do blunt damage, maybe more than the average.
Interesting.
So that's the argument that when I mean by when you were saying like, you know, you don't want to make categories, is the argument should be more or less what makes sense. If you're picking up it's not just the weapons look similar, how are they meant to be used? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
A stabbing weapon like a halberd or a halberd is more of a slashing. Sometimes with it could be piercing because it has the tip. Sometimes it's stabbing, but a lot of times it's slashing.
Very much so.
So if you are trained in that, I would say you're more likely to justify to me that you can use a bow staff versus a spear.
Very much so.
Because the halberd is much more of the same movements you do with the bow staff.
You're not trying to stab your target, which is a very much different feel. And like, if you're constantly coming at your target from like a head-on perspective versus from a side-on perspective,
it's and you can even, and I can even make arguments of, hey, you're used to a halberd, you're picking up a spear, so you're going to be able to use it in battle, but you're going to lose 1 attack, for every other round, and you're going to lose some damage because you're using it wrong. You keep trying to slash instead of stab. You know what I mean? Like, you could easily overcome that in the conversation, and I think that's the direction I would want to go. Because obviously we always love making harder rules or like hard set rules for foundational purposes. Mm-hmm. But let's face it, until we get egotistical enough to think High Point can become its own book and become its own thing,
I still think it could. Like, I just don't think that's egotistical. I think that's beautiful.
I just don't know if I have enough. It'll depend on. And I also don't know if people would care.
There are so many books out there with so much less already.
I don't know. I don't pay attention to what actually goes into those.
I'll just say a lot of the content that you have isn't the same kind of content, because you look at a lot of these other, setting books, and they have a lot of like descriptions of like every location and telling you what it looks like, and you're probably gonna just be like, hey, this is like more lore about this place. This is like where this came from. This is how to set
things up and where
exactly.
And who knows? Maybe like I said, if I get egotistical enough to think that we could do that, but,
dude, that would be fun.
I just don't even know where I would start, but you know what I mean, like. That's why I want to encourage these ideas, because, for me, I don't expect people to watch this and go, oh, that's how I want to do it like he does in High Point. Because High Point's very unique. High Point doesn't work for the average type of campaign that most people run. But this idea of when somebody in combat, like let's say you have characters and you want to limit them, right, in combat. And let's say the fighter drops his sword or gets disarmed and takes the enemy's weapon. Maybe this episode will spur that conversation between that DM and that player. You know what I mean? And be like, hey, I'm not proficient, but it's close enough, right? Like, can I use it during this battle? Can I just forego X number of damage or forego this penalty, but still be able to use it, right? Like, the idea that this conversation could bleed more into the, you've lost your main weapon. Should that matter? Because again, I don't like the idea that you've lost your main weapon. Like even the idea that you could be up against someone with a short sword and you have a short sword, or a rapier versus a rapier. They disarm you and then you knock them prone and then disarm them and then you pick up their weapon. I'm not saying that in the real world, picking up someone else's rapier is going to, render you completely useless. You'll still be,
right.
But even from experience, I've rapier fought, and I've fought with different types. Each one feels different. Now, same mechanics, same methods, but it does take time to learn a weapon. And maybe you could even justify every time you pick up a new weapon, even if you're proficient in that type of weapon, maybe you roll a d6, and for that many rounds is how many rounds it takes you to learn it. So you could say you have a -2 penalty to all rolls on this new weapon for 1d6 rounds.
Right.
So if you roll one round, you're like, okay, the first round, the first attack you get -2, and then you get it. It's similar. It's the same size. It has the same wrapping. But then again, you'd be like, oh, 6 rounds. Oh, this thing is totally different. It's a different handle wrap. It looks like this guy's hand was smaller, so your hand barely fits inside the cradle. Mm-hmm. It's actually a couple inches shorter, so you don't have, like, every time you try to go to parry, you miss. Like, you can make the description of it's the same exact weapon, but
it's different
enough. There's enough difference. And again, like, I can't really, go to you for like bow staff or kendo because those are pretty standardized weapons.
They do have a lot of overlap, but there are some, like imagine if you were using tonfas or using kamas or using sais or whatever the case may be.
Especially anything with a handmade wrap, anything with a handle that was crafted, especially for the wielder. A lot of people, they customize these things for their grips. That can throw you off. And it's not enough to say you don't have proficiency in the weapon anymore.
Yeah.
But you could make the argument that it should be, hello from Germany. Hello. Thank you so much. What's brewing? No home brewing today. Well, actually, a little bit of home brewing. We're chit-chatting about the different ways that we've approached scaling mundane weapons and making them better over time to more encourage players to hold on to weapons instead of just constantly looking for what's the next thing that does more damage that I can wield. So that's where we're at. But thank you so much for joining us from Germany. That's so exciting. But yeah, and so that's the kind of conversation I think could be had in the moment. Is you could talk about like what I do, where proficiencies are based on the individual weapon, which I like. I am going to implement the knock-on effect that after so many proficiencies you're going to learn similar weapons. But I think that conversation in a combat situation or in an encounter, having people change up weapons, because I mean there some people do improvised weapon penalties,
right?
And you could essentially say that when it's a new weapon, even if you're proficient in it, I like this idea that there's a number of rounds that you're gonna be awkward with it instead of just instantly picking it up and I'm fine,
right?
Especially you could even especially applying this to magical weapons. Interesting. Like if you find a magical weapon, why isn't there like you have attunement, which is kind of like supposed to be roleplayed, which I gotta say attunement kind of sucks in D&D only because the movie, the D&D movie, the recent one that came out, showed off attunement so much better than the game is ever.
I really did enjoy how they went about it.
And I don't even mean the length of time or saying that DMs have to do this whole like interactive role play with the item. But what I mean by the idea that it's a struggle, that it's a process that they have to go through, and it's something that they have to overcome. It's not something D&D has ever really like done.
Yeah.
And that alone also shows, like, again, you get a new weapon. What's the first thing you want to do? Get it out of its sheath, wield it around, see its weight, like you said, see its weight. Where does it do? Like, so I like this idea that why don't we have that where if you can say, hey, I bought this weapon at a store, we're going to be in town for a week, I'm going to get over it, I'm going to use it. But if you find it in a dungeon delve, maybe there's going to be like a 1d6 round penalty where it's the very first time, even if it's a weapon it's the same exact weapon you carry, but because it's a new physical weapon, it's still going to take you 1d6 rounds to get used to it. Just as a general concept, that could add more dynamicism to combat and to this idea of I'm just going to pick up a weapon, of even if you're proficient in it, you're still just going to have to like take a couple rounds.
Yeah.
And even if it's a small thing, like again, just a -2 to all rolls associated. So
now is that going to be like, again, per weapon? So
I think I think it would be individual weapons. So now I don't want to be pedantic of every time you touch a new dagger.
But I get what you're saying.
I have 3 daggers. I don't have to do it every time. But like it would be situational. Like
if it's reasonable that it's a unique enough.
Yeah, like you've literally you've downed an enemy and you've picked up his weapon in the middle of combat. That's a situation that would justify it. You buy a new weapon at the merchant shop, it's assumed you're going to sit there and wield it a little bit.
Right.
Because again, a round is only a couple seconds, right? So we're really talking about what sounds like a long time, but again, you would have that same amount of time walking out of the weapon shop.
Yes.
That's the same amount of time of you buying that sword, taking it out of its sheath, wielding it in front of the shopkeep, paying for it with gold, and then as you're walking out, sheathing it. That's about what we're talking about. But in combat, you're actively using it, which is why, like we said, you usually don't do things that you're not trained in. Like you usually don't do a new technique until you practiced it. Why would you use a brand new weapon that you don't even know if it fits you in your hand immediately in combat without some getting used to it? And that's what I think. So I think this is like a tangent idea, but something else to spice up combat, because we've been talking about that a lot too, of how different ways to spice up combat.
Very much so.
And that idea of if you're going to not switch weapons, but if you're going to full on take on a new weapon in certain situations, totally makes sense that there's going to be a learning curve.
A little bit of a learning curve.
I think that'd be kind of cool.
I'm not opposed to that either.
And then Pepe says, so I'd like to go with the simple fact that magic items cost a lot of gold, so why does some people not treasure them? Yes, right? So there is a concept too of, from the character's point of view, you either spent a lot of gold or risked your life to get this magical item. Why in 3 days time would you immediately get rid of what you just spent 90% of your wealth on? Because what? It does 1 extra point of damage. Like, why aren't you more attached to these weapons? Like in High Point, I like to believe that not everybody's starting weapon is personal. Like you and Vixie are a little bit different because Daft had his dad's staff,
right?
And Vixie had a sword that her father gave her. Completely different situations, but the
just so happened.
But you two have a starter weapon that you built into your backstory. Both of you wanted this item in your backstory from the get-go. It was part of your character, and I added reason to keep those weapons, right? Part of again, not having every weapon at your disposal makes it a lot harder to want to get rid of it on top of the role play. But again, the idea that the first time someone usually gets a magical weapon, like when you guys win the Faction 5, when the Faction 5 first came across that magical dagger that you guys made out of the dragon scale.
Yeah.
That was like one of the first magical items that y'all got. And it was a very basic magical item. It was just basically like barely a +1 dagger. But the situation that happened, like how you guys came about it, it was so iconic to the team. Like that was the item for the team for that campaign, for that time frame, for those few gaming sessions. And that's what I like to do is like make those items matter on a personal level, but also mechanically, because no one's going to keep a personal item that doesn't do anything unless they just keep it on their inventory list and never touch it.
Right.
But giving them reason to continue messing with it, I 100% agree that, these are so expensive and personalized. Why would you just be willing to get rid of them so easily? Another reason could be glory. If a character's burning sword could become easily nickname. Exactly, too, right? You have all of these people who have these magical weapons that do things. And more times than not, because again, especially with 5th edition, it's all combat. It's a lot of it's combat focus and a lot of it's min-maxing focus. So you do want this idea of the weapon that's going to win the battle, but no one really thinks of like how your character is seen with that weapon, right? So like this idea of like George the Flame Sword, right? Because you always carried around the +1 sword that could go on fire. Just because you found a more powerful sword that does couple extra points of damage, but this is like your icon, right? Where is that in D&D? And that's where kind of Love Murder Rose's idea of like the Kintsugi idea of,
So I've had this idea for a while now. And I really want to figure out like how I want to implement it, whether I think it should be like a general thing that anybody can do or it's specific to specific weapons. But the idea of being able to absorb weapon essence. So it's like, hey, I have this weapon. I got a brand new weapon. It's not my kind of weapon. I don't want to wield that weapon, but it's got this really cool ability. It's got this really cool thing it can do. It's like, imagine you go to a dungeon and you spend all this hard work to get down to the middle of this dungeon. You want the treasure that's at the end of this dungeon. And the treasure is something you can't use.
What you're looking for, essentially in High Point, it does exist, and I think in second edition it can't exist, but what you're essentially looking for is the ability to rip out an enchantment. Because essentially that's the equivalent of D&D is, it would be an enchanted item. It has a spell or some kind of imbued power that you want to imbue yours in. Now,
basically, in a sense, yeah.
And yeah, there are ways that you can do that where you can learn ways to unenchant. You can basically open up an enchantment and remove the spell that's in there and transfer it to another item or destroy it. The idea is you can destroy it or transfer it to another item. That does exist in High Point. And it vaguely, if I remember correctly, exists in second edition with some...
But I think mine's more akin to... Because a lot of the times what you have to do is you have to replace, you have to... you have to choose whether you want this ability or this ability. And I think that's good overall. But... like, even if there was just, if there was a weapon that existed or an item that existed that could, because like even in the what do you call it, in the warlock class, they have the ability to have like their packed weapon when they choose pact to the blade, but it doesn't have to be a blade. You can turn that weapon into anything, and if you get like a new magical weapon, you can absorb it into your packed weapon, and then that weapon's abilities can be changed into any of these other weapons. Like an idea of like an innate weapon that might be able to be anything, but it has the ability to like absorb. I don't know if you ever watched the really old school show called Heroes, where this dude called Sylar could just like take all the powers of all the other people. But you have to look at
what you're saying though, is because absorb what? Because the only thing in D&D are enchantments. Like the weapons usually have enchant. Like when you say absorb, like I understand that you're saying like, hey, I wield a sword and I don't want to stop wielding this sword, but this other sword has an enchantment on it that I want. Like that I understand, but what other abilities does a weapon, like what do you mean by you want, like, cause like you can't be like, hey, this weapon has reach because it's so tall, I want my short sword to have reach now.
Right, no,
that's not what you're asking
no,
for.
it's, and I think...
But if you're asking for like...
enchantments, I think of very specifically like, hey, I had a mage and he came over here and I want to enchant this weapon. Well... not necessarily all weapons are like that. I would say something similar to Kitsugi's weapon. That might not have been an enchanted weapon, but if you're calling that any magical effect...
That's what I mean. Like those charges, like a wand of fireball, that's an enchantment. Like in D&D terms, like we're not talking about like what enchantment means to us, but in D&D terms, that wand has an enchantment on it because that's how it was created.
Then yes, very
someone
much so.
enchanted it in order to cast fireball 3 times. So if a sword can, shift forms or make a spell happen, in D&D, just raw terms, we just call that an enchantment. So what you're doing is you want to be able to rip the enchantment off of something and imbue yours with it, which can be done. Like I said, in High Point and in second edition, that can be done. Typically, there are limits on how, like, especially with second edition, it all comes down to the cost of the item. The higher the cost of the item, the more it can hold. So if you had a really, really expensive item, and if you said that your item upgrades its cost with you because it's like the War Pact or whatever, you could justify consistently saying, hey, every so many levels I can add another enchantment or...
shoot, I'll dump money into it if I could like make it more valuable and hold more enchantments.
And that's the thing is like easy way to add value to something is like, hey, I have this dagger and it's like 500 gold, too cheap to put an enchantment on it. Okay, replace the pommel with a gemstone. It's part of the dagger now. And it just increased the price by exactly the amount of the gemstone's worth, right? And the gemstone now becomes part of the enchantable process. Why do you think like bags of holding are typically bejeweled bags? It makes them more powerful or makes them more expensive, so more magic can be dumped into it, right? Which is typically why magical items, the most powerful ones, are typically jeweled or crested or something ornate, because the typical D&D fashion is the more expensive, the more value, the more fine quality it is, therefore the more it can hold.
Right.
And I would say that, yeah, there's an easily justifiable, I think, like in certain situations, like with like you said, with like certain warlocks, or again, if you wanted to again, work at making a certain weapon that could do that. I think that there's a justification for that. I think that even outside of that, I don't know if I'd want this to be just acceptable to anyone, but I do like the idea of almost adding this as like an artificer subclass. Or maybe like, so imagine like a artificer, but instead of tinkering with stuff, they're like, you know how artificers typically their ability is to imbue, that I can supercharge a weapon, or they can even grant a new charge. Like if a wand or if a sword has 3 charges and it's out, some artificers, like, you can actually charge that charge back and give that weapon its charge again.
Right.
Imagine the reverse. Imagine an artificer who, what you can do is transfer. You can take a charge of something for like once per day, or like it's, you know, it's an ability.
Oh, interesting.
Where you can say this weapon, I'm going to move one thing from one weapon to the other, and I can do this as a certain ability, right? Like a spell or something. I could see that. I would say that something like that should be doable, but it should have limitations, right? You don't you don't want to be Siler, where it's like, hey, this weapon, it can cast Fireball, and it can banish you, and if it touches you, it absorbs your soul. Oh, and it can turn into any weapon I want. Oh, and it casts Shield 15 times. Like,
right.
You really don't want to have it overly powerful, but I do like this idea of the right type of person having the right type of weapon and kind of doing what you want. Like what you're saying, like, hey, for every 3 levels, because it's, you know, the one weapon I've always had, every 3 levels I can add 1 more spell to it. So by level 9, it can have 3 enchantments.
Right.
And like at level 12, it can have 4 enchantments, but maybe you find a weapon you can swap out enchantments like too, right? Like maybe that's a thing where you could be like, I have these 3, I want that one, but I also want that one. I'll get rid of this one.
Right. And it balances itself out.
And the idea of like, if you're doing it with like a subclass, like an artificer, maybe it's a 1-to-1 swap. So you have to be able to touch both weapons, and then you can exchange them.
Interesting.
So you don't lose, so nothing's lost. You never lose anything. All you can do is exchange.
Right. Okay.
So I just you know, there's arguments to be made for that exact idea. But yeah, I think that, you know, when it comes down to it, there's very few rules as written examples of why you should hold on to a weapon, why you should keep it, why you should feel connected.
And it does feel bad.
It goes against all lore.
It feels like so much goes to waste.
Like think about it. Excalibur would never have worked in D&D. Unless it is the most powerful weapon you can get. Excalibur, the whole legend, doesn't make sense in D&D.
Now, if you're talking about the Excalibur from Soul Eater, then it might be the most powerful.
But you know what I mean? Like, the idea, though, is this legendary weapon that foretold kings.
Right.
You go and grab this sword, the King of Kings sword. And it's a +3 and it does a D8 of damage. And you're telling me that you're going to hold on to that forever? No. The moment you get a +10 that's a plus, or a D8 that's a +4, like, the moment you find a better weapon, bye. Unless it does something profoundly different. If it's just a magical weapon with some pluses, if it's just a plus magical weapon, it doesn't matter what the lore is. D&D doesn't care. It's like, because I mean, think about, and this is one of the reasons, if you all want to know why I typically don't get super hyped about like all of the stuff that's in D&D, because I mean, there are so many books out there about magical items. Like, we do homebrew review. Why? Because I like to encourage the creativity of people. And yes, there are thousands of already accepted by the book magical items out there that you will never run out. You can literally campaign your whole life and never run out of items with how many books there are on just magical items. But not to say that those aren't any good, but I really don't want to spend hours upon hours reading all of them to find the one that fits the situation that I'm looking for. So I don't want to read through 15 books to find the one dagger that's like, finally, that's the item I need. Mm-hmm. I'd rather just make it myself in the situation I need it. So that's one of the reasons. And 2, there are so many because they know instinctually they're going to get replaced. D&D isn't about creating like, hey, here's this cool, awesome weapon. You're never going to drop it. It's hey, here's a cool, awesome weapon, but here's another one, but here's another one, but here's another one. Here's also a similar one. Here's one that's not similar, but you'll like it anyway.
And I really feel like they want to give you, they throw this stuff out there, but like it's for inspiration, just like everything else in D&D. It's like you can take it, you can build off of it. Hey, you see this cool idea for weapon that's just this regular ass weapon that just sits here? Well, you can take it and you can turn it into the most powerful weapon in the world. You can upgrade it and turn it into something cool. It's a foundation for you to use for whatever the heck you want to use it for. But I don't know. I think it's really great. I think it does a lot of cool stuff. But
fucking chat.
I know, man. We out here getting
everyone loves Excalibur. Excalibur was one of the best fucking characters.
So in ridiculous. So ridiculous. I'm still mad I haven't finished that show.
Excalibur.
Hey man, you gotta let the man sing.
You gotta let the man sing. Like how dare you interrupt the glory of Excalibur's song?
Disrespectful.
But yeah, so I think I'm gonna make some adjustments to High Point. I'm gonna add on that knock-on effect, but I think that at 5th edition, as it stands now, it suffers from trying to give everybody everything, especially when it comes down to weapons. It's just like hey, here's weapons. Here's a list of mundane standard weapons, but we know you don't care about those. Go find some magical weapons, and here's a fuck ton to do. And it's like, it doesn't... I don't think you should need a magical weapon for the game to be fun, but it also feels like it's a constant, like... loot game too. I also don't like the mentality. I don't like loot-based campaigns where it's like, okay,
you're just here to stack your inventory and
or
stuff,
it's like every campaign. It's like, every gaming session is like, okay, here's a battle. Okay, loot everything. What's the best thing? Who gets what? Okay, go into the next battle. Okay, loot everything. What's the next weapons we get? Like, just the loot-based where it's like the dungeon delve. Every level, you're gonna all get something new and all something fantastic for the next level, and it's like. That just doesn't feel right. I like the idea of having a reason to hold on to things and it being like you've been good. This has been good, but
I enjoy like, especially when loot happens, like I enjoy being able to sit back and let everybody take all the loot because like I don't need any of it. Like none of it's really gonna help me. Like I don't want to just sit here and hoard loot, but if something like really plays to me, really speaks to me, like it's nice, it's rewarding,
Mm-hmm.
But being able to find things, that are gonna be beneficial, that you can use to like help you, that can use to help make you better, like anyways, like I find that so valuable to and again, that's what a lot of this is for, is it's for us to be able to say, hey, I want it to feel like the stuff that I have, the stuff that I'm doing is actually valuable. I want it to feel like I get something out of all of this. But a lot of the times it's like, oh, all that work that I put into getting really good at using this weapon is now just out the door because now I got to go pick up another one, right? And because this one over here is just objectively better for me. And if you're a character, in this world, I don't think that's going to be a realistic situation. I don't think you're going to look at this brand new weapon that you've never touched before and be like, realistically, this is objectively better.
And that's the other thing, is that metagaming, right? It's like, oh, that's a great sword. Oh, that's better than what I have, and I can use it. I'm going to pick that up. It's like that's not how a character would, like, that's not how a real person or a character or a hero would go about that, right?
Yeah.
And like I said, I like the idea that there's I want not only for them to have a reason to hold on to it, but if there's a reason to let it go, I want that reason to be a hard decision, right? Like there was a podcast I listened to, one of the few that I can actually listen to, like the gameplay version of it,
right,
without it being too like, scripted.
Yeah.
And one of the things they found was they like ripped off some wizard, and they had found this scimitar that was like a +1, and it was like bluish. It gave off a bluish hue, and whenever like you swung it in the air, basically snow, like when like you slash it in the air,
cool.
Snow would fall. It was like basically an ice scimitar. And it would do ice damage. It would do extra ice damage, and then every time you swung it, kind of like a lightsaber, instead of it going woo and everything, it would just leave a
little trail of snowflakes,
and it would just fall. And that's all it did. And they nicknamed it the Snowmatar.
The Snowmatar,
because it was awesome. And they had it for a couple of gaming sessions, and it wasn't like primarily used every gaming session, but when extra damage was needed, it was there. But then I remember a couple of gaming sessions later, it was like they needed to do something, and I think they needed to exchange something like for a value, and it was like pivotal to one of the characters' like story arcs, and they ended up using the Snowbatar as the bartering ship. But it wasn't like just I don't need this anymore, I got something better. It was this is really like the best thing for my partner. I mean, I don't really use it all the time, but man, like the Snowmatar,
it's
like
so good. It's so cool.
And it was like iconic. It was like for that character. So it was that whole thing of like, that's what I mean by it doesn't have to be the most powerful weapon, but you have to not want to give it up, right? But you also don't want people just to hoard it. You don't just want them to hold like 15 weapons that all have a sentimental value. Like there has to be that ebb and flow. Give people a reason, but. Interesting. Okay, so Hoilepa has a interesting house rule that any weapon above a +1 cannot be found by the players. I asked if this is like they can only be purchased or how would they come across them. So the house rule is that they can only be created or hunted. If they want better gear, they will not find it.
They won't find in a dungeon.
Yeah, they won't find it in the dungeon or like the next tavern if you want something out of work for it. So the idea is that you're not just going to go easy dungeon and just stumble across a +5 sword. You're not just going to go into a shop and get a +3 dagger. Mm-hmm. The idea is that in this particular case, if you can't make it yourself, do research. Oh, I want a +3 dagger. I know of a dark wizard who has a sacrificial dagger that he uses that should be a +3. I got to go get that guy. Or I know a dragon's horde who has a mythical single item in it. Or like the idea that it's not just gonna be there in some random treasure table.
Right.
You have to in-game find a reason or a purpose to justify how you're gonna get a hold of this. That's not bad. Especially for anything over a +1. That's not bad. It's not bad.
I like that idea.
It's a good house rule for especially early DMs who don't know how you want to level out your magical items. Giving people up to a level 1 and then making it harder is actually a good start out to not let your players get too overpowered.
Right.
Especially as early DMs. Because I know early DMs have an issue if smart players get a powerful weapon too early. Early DMs can struggle. This could be a good way to start out.
Yeah, no, I definitely feel that. I think one of the biggest things, especially in 5th edition, that they do is they make so many things either resistant or immune to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage.
Right.
So at a certain point in the game, it just makes mundane weapons useless. Like, absolutely. And it's not like, oh, yeah, you're gonna be sitting here hacking away for days to just try and get through these people,
right?
Because everything's gonna be halved.
And that's why, and that is one of the reasons that I do have the mechanic that you can basically, like, not everything, right? Like, you can't just go buy any old dagger at the store and turn it magical by normal means. Like, I still follow the rules of it has to be of a certain quality and a certain make, a certain level before it could become magical. But this is why I do have the ability in High Point that if you have excess XP, you can pump it into your weapons in order to make them better.
So I have an idea that I really want to implement, and I want to hash it out before I do so. But the idea that similar to the monks, at a certain, because I believe that this should be accurate for like a certain level of player, but at a certain level you can almost use, because everyone, no matter who you are, no matter what you are, everyone has their own, I don't want to just call it chi, but they don't have their own energy.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Right? And so I believe that at a certain level of experience, you have the ability to use and control your energy. And especially if you've been using a weapon for a certain period of time, I would say that you can use your own. It's not going to give it any additional strength. You're not going to get a +1 to hit. You're not going to get a +1 to damage.
You want to be able
you
to
are
say
going
it's
to
now considered.
It overcomes the resistances to non-magical
it's
effects.
like when you have natural weapons like claws that that aren't a +1. They don't have any extra magical abilities, but they do act as a magical means. And that's one of the reasons why, that's the reason why I say that I have the mechanic where you can pump XP into your weapons. The only reason why I say that there's a limitation is it's like, it's not just any old weapon can do it, but typically, like, if it's your starting weapon, again, it's usually like, unless you have a really, really detailed backstory that says you have a really crap weapon, the idea is that most of your starting weapons, I'm just going to default to, are good enough quality. And then certain weapons, again, have situationalness to it. It's just more of a, you're not going to buy just 10 daggers and be able to pump them.
Right.
But yes, the same reason applies. Is the idea is that being able to pump XP into it starts the process off of it becoming imbued with magical essence, being able to overcome the magical defenses of the non-magical defense, and then eventually making it a +1 and then beyond. And then another aspect of that is once you have a +5 or higher, the chance for the weapon to gain sentience begins.
Right.
So any +5 weapon in high point has a chance to gain sentience, and that chance is compounding every point beyond that. So if it doesn't
at a +5. Side note, I know we were talking about like Bankais and stuff like that, and that Bankais is a sentient weapon, essentially. And so does that mean that if you get it that high, it could develop, or that it has to get that high in order for it to even be possible to become a weapon of that nature?
Bankais have to be a +10.
A +10. Okay, so it can get above a +5. I thought +5 was the highest.
No, you can go above +5, but that's when you get beyond mortal capabilities.
Okay.
So that's why Bankais can only be created.
When you say beyond mortal, that means no mortal can have a +10 weapon?
No mortal can create a greater than +5. Like, once you have a +5 weapon, you have to have non-mortal means to continue expanding it. So you have to have some sort of immortal level power to help go beyond 5.
So
but you can now, wielding them is a little bit different story. A mortal can wield those powerful things, but the understanding of what, like, a mortal holding onto a Bankai is just a sword to them. It's kind of like the attunement thing, where it may be a +10 Bankai, but a mortal just holding it around is just a sword. Like, it's just the basic sword, because they aren't attuned. Not the D&D attunement, but they aren't attuned with their Bankai.
So you're saying a mortal could not attune with a Bankai. You have to be...
Typically not, because the Bankai would probably either dissolve the mortal's brain or take over the mortal's body. Because the Bankais, for the most part, don't necessarily always want to be there. Like, they don't necessarily want to be trapped.
But I thought a lot of them were developed based upon the character of their wielder.
The initial ones, yes. Older Bankais have had changes of heart over the decades and centuries. So some Bankais have new masters.
So you're talking about if a mortal were to just happen upon an already existing Bankai, they would likely not be able to just be like, let me attune to this sucker.
It would basically be like, they would not have any perception that it's anything beyond that. But if they did and then attempted to wield it, the Bankai would basically win over. It's basically not even a contest of wits, right? So the Bankai would basically take over the mortal. If it's one of those that wants out, it could. Most mortals would die in the presence of an actual Bankai, so nothing would happen. But yeah, typically those are Bankai type weapons because they're beyond the mortal concepts, because they're not mortal weapons. I don't typically let just players have a Bankai. That's my game plus. When I say, like, when I've told you all you can ascend to godhood and ascend to immortality, but the game doesn't end there. Those are the things of beyond like, you can't be a soul reaper or even like deal with them. Kind of like, I mean, again, think about Bleach. You can't even go there if you're alive. So if you're immortal and you're alive, that's a whole realm that's off to you. But it doesn't mean that you can't get there. It doesn't mean that you can't interact with it. It doesn't mean that you can't play that. But you're not going to create a character instantly going into that. You're going to have to be one of my veteran players. You're going to have to have unlocked it in game, done all of this stuff, and then you can go play in it. But that's the idea of, like, that's why it's a +10, because it's not just a weapon that has, like, okay, so you have your magical weapons. Once they reach +5, they have a chance to gain sentience on their own. Lesser magical weapons can. have intelligence, but that's more of like a soul binding. Mm-hmm. Like you could have a +2 that has a consciousness, but that's more like someone's soul got bound to it. The weapon to have its own consciousness has to be a +5. Beyond that, it's more and more likely every time it gets bumped. Now, there are multiple types of consciousness. There's the consciousness that was created by the weapon, like of the weapon itself, because of its power, and then you can put a consciousness into it.
Real quick, when it comes to the XP, you said as a mortal you can only put 5 levels of XP into a weapon.
You can only bring it up to a +5.
So if I keep dumping XP into it after that, is that not possible, or will it do nothing?
DM has to think of how he wants to answer.
These are my favorite questions. When I can make that happen.
As far as the mortal knows, nothing happens.
Got it. Now...
But the XP isn't wasted. And mechanically speaking, unlike a spell that nothing happens but you lose it anyway, you don't lose the XP. Like, it doesn't not go anywhere. You put the XP into the weapon. From your point of view, nothing happens. You could do it forever, and you will never, as a mortal, see that benefit.
Interesting.
But your XP will continue to go into the weapon.
Got it.
What that XP does is not a mortal idea anymore.
Now, though it's not a mortal idea, does the fact that I'm putting it in there have an effect on what's happening?
Yes.
Okay.
So imagine that the idea that once you're at level 5, it's like, imagine like, okay, you bought a spa, little hot tub, fill it up with water. That's your XP. Now you want maybe like a jacuzzi, a little bit more water. Now you want a swimming pool, a little bit more water. Level 5 is like an Olympic pool. It's going to take you a long ass time to fill that bitch. And you can just keep pumping water into it. But from your perspective, you can't tell how much the water is raising. It's just in there. You're not going to make a bigger pool. Like at that point, you can't make an ocean. Like you can't make an ocean. You can't fill the ocean, but you can fill an Olympic pool. But you put water in the ocean and you lower the salinity of it. You put flavored water in there and it slightly changes that area.
It has an effect, yes.
So you're essentially, the idea is that by the time it's level 5, your XP that you're pumping into it, in its terms of its growth, is so small, it's like you pissing in an empty ocean. Doesn't matter how long you do it, you're never going to fill the ocean by pissing into it. But that doesn't mean that your addition to what is already there isn't affecting it.
So...
Does that make sense?
To an extent.
You're just no longer increasing its power value. What you're doing is you're adding now modifiers. You're essentially, the more you do that, the more background stuff happens.
Theoretically, could I, as a mortal, over level my +5 weapon all the way up to where it would have enough experience to get to a +10? In the background, whatever.
So that's the idea is once it gets to level 5, your XP, like up to level 5, you can think of it as like a 1-to-1 ratio. You're giving it its own, your XP equivalency. Once it's at level 5, the equivalency exchange of what it needs to now level up, like let's say once it gets to level 5, it resets to its own tier. Now it only needs 100 XP to level up. You can't give it enough XP as a mortal.
Even hit one of those points.
That's the idea. Your experience is going in, but once you're at level 5, to get to level 5 to 6, mortal XP just can't do it.
Okay, so then here's the question. Here's the question. I don't know if this counts as different XP, because you can theoretically tithe your XP to a god.
Which is exactly, yes, and that's exactly what you're doing to the weapon. You're tithing it to the weapon, yes.
Could you... I don't know if this question even makes sense. Could you get your god to put the XP into it so that it actually increases its level? Well, something to that effect.
Well, and that's why a mortal can only get a weapon to a level 5 by mortal means. this is where now you need something beyond. And by mortal means your mortal XP and mortal magic can do nothing to increase it. Like on a mortal level, you cannot, as a mortal, do anything more. You have to get something beyond your mortal understanding of magic. You have to have divine intervention, an immortal who has understanding of weapons. Like you could find an immortal priest or an immortal wizard who has enchantment knowledge beyond that of mortals, who could then enchant it up a level. Like there's plenty of ways to continue leveling it, and a mortal can still hold the weapon, but the fact that the mortal can't be the cause, because the understanding and the power needed is just beyond your capability.
No, I definitely get that. And so theoretically, if they did get leveled to a 6 or a 7 or whatever, they would still be wielding a 6 or a 7, but any, we'll say, divine abilities they just wouldn't have access to.
Correct.
Okay.
As far as they're concerned, they're wielding the +5.
They're wielding the +5 or they're wielding the +6?
Well, they're still, you still get the extra like natural like pluses, but like if there was any additional features that came with it, that's beyond their
like theoretically level. If you would sprout angel wings, then you wouldn't get that ability, all the other stuff it could do.
If at +7 it got a 1 charge per day to do something, you can't do that. You can't activate the charge because you're not able to activate those levels yet. Now, obviously, in High Point, there's always an exception. There's some sort of always
there's
an
a
exception.
way to do it.
But in general, when I say, like, I have these rules, in general, these are pretty static. Like, if any player or NPC comes across these types of weapons, these are the general rules I follow.
For sure.
And then not only does that allow for consistency in the storytelling and in the roleplay aspect, but it also keeps a lot of consistency with how I separate the mortal gameplay from the higher tier gameplay. And these are some of those limiters I put, because again, if you can do godlike stuff as a mortal, then why become a god? Like you want to encourage the idea of like High Point exists as a cyclical cycle. It's a power generation, right? Power needs to go and flow. And that's where you have all of these balances, right? But the idea of ascension is in High Point. The reason why you can become a god is because there's always a need to be filled. So we want that power to be escalated, but it needs to have a separation. Only certain people should be able to elevate themselves.
I don't want to get too off topic for where we're going, but
I mean, we're pretty much done with the topic at hand. I think we've discussed the topic today.
I mean, we did do a fairly... Clearly, an immortal is something different than a god.
Yes.
Right?
100%.
I would say, correct me if I'm wrong, immortals are much lower tiers.
Immortal is basically one tier above mortal. It's the first.
What about
level.
demigod? Are they on the same playing field, or are they?
Typically, demigods are above an immortal. Like they are immortals, but they're a category above. Immortalhood is just basically it's the first pantheon, you could say, of godhood.
Would an immortal have the ability to do things like wield bankais and put XP into like...
Yeah, you do not have to be a god to wield a +10. You just can't be a mortal.
Okay, and if you were to put a definition to a High Point immortal, what are the qualifications? What makes you... Are you literally like, you won't die of old age?
Yeah.
Is that basically it?
You can't die of natural means. You have less... I mean, basically, you don't suffer... Typically, immortals don't suffer the same stringence of mortals. They can still die. You can still be killed. But you won't just die.
Do they, like, not need to sleep anymore?
Correct. Yeah.
You
don't have any of the aliens of mortalhood. You have like you have better memory recall. You have longer memory, unlike a mortal who just like if you were a mortal and stayed alive long enough, you would just suffer from the same concept of memory as a normal mortal. Immortals have essentially their minds are unlocked on a whole other plane of existence kind of thing. So their whole life, in a human's life is like you recounting a book that you read last week. Like that's how easily accessible
Got
that
you.
level of memory is. Whereas a 80-year-old would have a hard time remembering,
what they did when they were a kid.
Yeah, but an immortal would basically just recount it like a book. Like not photographic memory unless they were old enough and trained in it. But
Yeah, I mean, I have trouble remembering what I did yesterday sometimes.
But once you reach immortalhood, the ascension from immortal into immortal, there's a lot of different paths after that, right? It's not just a linear progression.
Would you say that it unlocks a clearer recollection of your own personal past and experiences, or would you say from that point forward you have better recollection of your...
It's once you become an immortal, everything that you've ever been associated with comes into clear view. So like all of your mortal memories, or basically your life, is surprisingly mundane to you now.
It goes from VHS to HD.
Yeah, it's surprisingly mundane how easy it is for you to just look back on your life and all of your knowledge. But the difference is you may gain all of that, but you don't gain new knowledge of your life. You don't gain knowledge of things you didn't know, like, hey, who kicked me that one day that I didn't see? Right. You don't gain that knowledge like unlike a god would, where a god, when you get to a certain level of immortality, when you become godhood, you actually unlock knowledge, like past knowledge, historical and future knowledge. Like you have the knowledge of the universe unlocked to you, whereas an immortal, it's really just a more clarity. It's more like all of those filters your pesky little human brain can't overcome, gone. Everything you've experienced was always technically there. You can now just recollect it now.
Though you have the ability, there are many different ways to become a god. And I'm assuming there are many more ways to become an immortal.
Correct.
Because, it's a much simpler feat,
In comparison, yes.
So like, if we're talking scalability,
Ooh.
like, could, in order to even think about becoming a god, you're probably going to have to be at least level 20, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is the same true for an immortal?
So say that one more time.
If you're gonna even think about trying to become a god, it's likely, not necessarily impossible, but likely that you're gonna need to be at least level 20 to attempt a feat such as that.
Right, gotcha.
Right? Is the same true for becoming an immortal? Or are there...
So when it comes down to that, because of the ways that you can become a god and or an immortal, you would believe, and most likely, just for the average person who wants to try to ascend in my realm, it's going to take you the vast majority of a campaign like that. Like you would have to be quite a high level to obtain it. Now, there are no hard and fast rules of what level you have to be at to obtain immortality. It's just the likelihood of you obtaining one of those opportunities before a certain level is just astronomically low, the lower the level, right? Because the ways to ascend either to godhood or immortality, right? Because godhood, there's so many less ways to do it because there's so many less positions to fill. Whereas with immortality, I mean, a god could just like you. A god could just be like, hey, you're cool. Don't die anymore. That's it. You're immortal now. You're the lowest level of immortal. It means nothing. You have no real power. But a god can literally just make you immortal without a second thought.
So
that's how
say that happens. Say I'm a level 10 character and a god's just like, I want you to be immortal now. Am I a level 10 immortal?
No. So the leveling gets completely out of whack there, but it depends on what kind of immortal you are. If they just make you if they make you immortal, you would just be a level 10. You would just be a level 10 who is immortal.
But you wouldn't be an immortal.
If you were made an immortal, there's a little bit difference because typically, the reason is immortality is a thing. But when I say like ascension to being immortal, typically when you ascend, it's not just I have this ability to not die. It's not a trait or a perk you get. It's typically a position you have to hold. So if a god's going to turn you into an immortal, they may make you immortal. They may just say you can't die from mortal means anymore. But to be told, hey, you're going to ascend, I'm earning this right, you're typically going to hold some sort of position. That could be a holy knight of a god. So they may want, instead of being a paladin as a mortal, maybe they want you to fight for them on like as their right hand. So that's that could be an immortal ascension. You could be a holy knight for a god. You could accept a mantle of like in Dresden Files, you haven't gotten here yet, but like Harry Dresden, the main character, is offered the mantle of the Winter Knight by Mab. She offers him the mantle because she needs a new Winter Knight because hers died. So she wanted him to take it. She tried so hard for him to take the mantle.
Wizard gonna be a knight?
But she wanted him to take the mantle, and he was very much against it. So there's a big whole thing in the book about that. But that's an immortal, right? So like even something from the Fae can make you an immortal. But typically when you are made an immortal, when you take that ascension, it's a position. It usually comes with a caveat. You usually have it's a bargain. You're going to do X, Y, Z for this immortality. And it could be anywhere from a specific god, or it could be a normal position. You could be kind of similar to a god that has a sphere of influence. You could be responsible for something. So it's like you're an immortal and your whole job is to just travel around and watch this thing and balance it out, or just watch it and report back, or don't do anything. Just if I ever need information, this is what you need to pay attention to wherever you go. Like there's just usually some sort of, again, you're the lowest level of the corporation, but you're in the corporate world now.
So you ever seen the or heard of the anime One Punch Man?
Yeah.
So do you know his training regimen?
No.
So the mindset, the theory behind One Punch Man, what he tells everybody is like, how did you become this hero? He did 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats, and a 10-kilometer run every day for 3 years. And then he was this. And all of a sudden, he was just wearing his tie and fucking punching lobsters and doing all kinds of crazy shit. Like, that just basically... And so, here's the deal. I don't think that it's remotely in question that One Punch Man is an immortal. Like... I don't know what happened. He was a regular dude. He was just a human, and then he went from that to that, from doing that for 3 years, supposedly. So, is there anything... Now, what I mean by, like, is there any ability for someone to just naturally evolve into immortal based upon their actions throughout life? I guess that's my question.
Natural immortality is... somewhat of a myth. It has happened, but a natural immortality that has no external force is extremely rare. The methods of that, typically I'll give you the in and out of game. The methods of that are unknown, and even to Zenith, the idea of just becoming an immortal, he knows is technically within the realm of possibility, but it's not a process people could do. Right? It's not like there's not an SOP. There's not like a written.
Right.
This is how it would happen. He knows it can happen. It has happened, but also looking at what I mean by that is from his point of view, it's not meaning that a god has to make a decision. Not necessarily an entity has to make a decision, but a series of events, you could say, has to occur, right? Like accepting the mantle, whether that's a god giving you one, creating one for you, a natural mantle finding you manifesting one.
No, usually with a mantle, there is a lot of power and responsibility that comes with that.
Typically, yeah.
Now, if we're talking about the very base version of an immortal, then we're talking about, now granted, yes, there's a lot unlocked. You are now, you can't die, your mind is unlocked, but do you get a lot of additional power with that? Do you get abilities? Is there certain things that just come with being an immortal outside of just not dying?
So that's where it all depends on how you ascend. Depending on the position you take, that could come with not just responsibilities, but it could come with perks. So, and that's why I said, like, just being immortal, not being able to die via normal means, right? You can get an arrow through the heart, just pull it out, and you're not going to die. You can eat whatever you want, you're not going to die. You can live forever, you're not going to die. That type of immortality is just a quirk of your that's the mortal version of immortality. Is it's a quirk between you and your relationship with the goddess of death. Like, you have basically a connection to your soul that's not going to go anywhere, whether fabricated or not. Mm-hmm. But being an immortal, the reason why natural immortality is not understood is because the way that everything works for the balance of High Point, since the War of the Fallen and since the War of Power, the structure doesn't really, like, there's no power vacuum for just an immortal to just be an immortal. Like, the way that that power flows through High Point is all of those powers are, like, that's why you have a position. All of those powers are manifested for purposes.
And I guess that was my question, is like, is there actual power that comes with that? And if there isn't, is it possible to just exist in a place? Because I think the biggest question that I have is if we're talking about the base immortality, the quirk you referred to earlier, does that include what you mentioned earlier about the unlocking of your mind?
No, just being able to not die, you're still a mortal who can't die. That's where the ascension comes in, because it unlocks, like, that's part of the power, right? The new type of way you can see the world, the way you can remember. And then, so the better answer your question, I should say that yes, it does come with a set of powers, but I should say that this is where I mentioned it before. This is game plus, right? You've adventured through level 20, level 30, level 50, whatever you are as immortal, you've now ascended. You are now essentially a level 1 immortal. You can just continue as is. You have all of your capabilities as you were as a mortal. You're now immortal, and you may or may not hold a position with responsibilities. But you're now in game plus. You're not stuck here. You're just now at the new ground zero.
Right.
You're now at level 1 of a whole new game. So that power, yes, it does come with power, but not always like a light switch. It's not always, I'm an immortal, now I can do X, Y, and Z.
Right.
But yes, becoming an immortal unlocks a whole concept of existence, because if you have a job,
and so that's your adventures. Saying that power has to have whatever power that's now a potential for you has to come from somewhere, whether it be a mantle, whether it be another god, whether it be a purpose for something, but just having it be in a vacuum for no reason technically is what is highly unlikely.
That's the rarity, is you to take on a mantle that doesn't have a purpose. Like, for you to become an immortal in that pantheon but without a purpose, it's like, well, where's the power then? Like, how are you manifesting godlike power, immortal power, without a drive? Like, remember, like, you have the weave, right? It's not like being an immortal isn't like a mage using the weave to cast magic. You are an immortal because the universe has you there for a purpose, and you need to fulfill that purpose. And by fulfilling that purpose, you become stronger, and you can level up in your immortalhood, getting closer to godhood. And there's it's just like right now, you can be different classes, and you can be different races, and you can level up and have character classes, and you can have all this character build. It's basically that, but on a different pantheon. You're no longer dealing with mortal problems. You're not having encounters where, hit points are a thing. It's more about the essence of your being and whether or not you're solving those level of problems. A lot of the game plus is more dialogue and diplomatic based more often than not. It's not a lot of combat, but there is combat. You still can die, but you're not dealing with hit points and blood and life. You're dealing with the actual essence that's keeping you, that is you. Like, you use magic as an immortal, and it's not like you have, spell slots. You have an essence of power, and once you've used out your available essence of power, the only thing you have left is your actual essence. You can still keep casting magic all you want, but you're literally using up your essence of existence.
Now, is that a finite resource?
That's how you can die. That's one of the ways you can die. You can literally use up your essence, because you're not mortal. You're not a physical form anymore. You are an entity of energy with a purpose, a flow in all of that vastness of High Point. So you literally,
an immortal loses. They basically ascend to like a fourth dimensional being. They're
you lose your physical form and you can remanifest it. You can avatar.
Right.
But you are not immortal. You lose you are now an entity of High Point.
Is that the same as a demigod? Are demigods these beings that don't have physical forms and they have to create avatars for themselves to come interact with the human world?
Typically not, because demigods are... It's really difficult to explain like how the pantheons work, because most gods don't... They take physical form, they don't have physical form. Demigods, for the most part, at least in High Point, for the vast majority, demigods are higher level, like they're not quite gods, but they're typically created in the mortal plane. Sometimes you can find demigods created outside the mortal plane, but we usually categorize those differently. Those aren't demigods, because demigods usually have something to do with a mortal counterpart.
Are we still considering demigods as something akin to the offspring of humans and the divine?
That's what I'm saying. It's some sort of mortal counterpart. So demigods typically have to have a mortal counterpart, whereas immortals were a mortal that came up into Ascension. Demigods were already there. They were already half ascended.
They started off as
whatever. Which is why technically you could say, well, they're half human or they're half mortal. Why are they more powerful than a mortal that became an immortal? But that's because half of them were always Pantheon. They literally started half Pantheon, which gives them a greater connection, and they already have essentially a mantle of purpose.
So would a level 1 ascended immortal going toe-to-toe with a level 1 demigod,
demigod would win, hands down. Demigod would flatten it, because again, just that fact of I'm already a Pantheon and you came up here, like it's like, hey, I'm how else to put it? It's like Bane, right? You
Bane?
know Bane from Batman.
From Batman?
Yeah, it's like the whole, you can have, you could see all the bad, but I was born in it. Like it's the idea of you can't comprehend the idea
you're coming from the outside in, like, and I'm coming from the inside out.
Yeah, it's like I don't just earn my place. Like I was this. This is me. My power is absolute because I'm a demigod.
Mowgli versus an actual cub.
Yeah, it's almost like yeah, and that's the thing is like that half of being an actual godlike creature, that actual full half flattens the fact that you ascended. You'd have to be several levels of immortal. Like you'd have to ascend several tiers in immortalhood to go toe to toe with the demigod.
So leveling up side by side, there's no equalization of those two. Like if
you're equal, no, the demigod will always be more powerful on an equal to equal like leveling basis.
On a 5 to 5,
you would have to be a higher tier immortal to handle a demigod.
Interesting.
But yeah, so when you were saying like the whole demigods typically have a given avatar, because the way that they were formed, they'll typically have a given avatar, meaning they didn't really choose how they look.
This is how they were born.
In the when they get powerful enough and can transition, they can begin to take more control over their form, like most gods, and they can take control of their avatar.
Kind of like dragons being able to shapeshift.
But for the most part, demigods are kind of forced into a form when they're in the mortal world, and when they're in the immortal world, they kind of act like the energy that all gods are. But it's harder for a demigod, like harder and easier. Demigods just have a natural state in the mortal world, which is their original state they were created in. They can easily learn the power to shapeshift. But if it just came down to you're thrown into the mortal world, they will default to the same form every time. Whereas an immortal, basically, for the most part, always remains invisible in the mortal world because you don't have a default avatar.
They're basically formless until unless you intentionally...
Most of them always they just go back to their mortal form. It's a default. But again, if you were to, without their knowledge, if you just took both, a demigod and immortal, and just instantaneously put them in the mortal plane, one would disappear and the other one would take its natural form before their, cognitive
its original
decisions.
form, yeah.
A couple things from chat, though. Hoilepa made a good comment about the difference between the Bankai and the Shikai from Bleach. One being the conversation you can have, and one being the actual enslavement of the thing. And I thought about doing that in High Point and breaking it all down even more so. but I have other aspects that do that. But yeah, basically, good point though is that there actually is in Bleach an actual like a better understanding. Again, mine's only loosely based off of Bleach. It's not like the full thing. But yeah, that was a good point to make.
I like that.
And then yeah, I do feed the weapon with XP, so it's not required, but it's basically like in High Point you can level up more than one level at a time, but only so many, right? So you can get a fuck ton of XP, but there's only so many levels that you can do. Because I just don't want, literally one fight to just max level people hella quickly. So you can essentially end up having excess XP. You can have, you could get 100,000 XP, but maybe you've only spent 80 to level up, so you have 20,000 left over, right? What are you going to do with it? You don't want to just waste it. So you can, if you're a follower or a cleric, you can tithe it to your god. Sometimes that will give them like special favors, or maybe they'll listen to your prayer. But tithing XP is even better than tithing gold. It's a higher value to a god. You can, and it's pretty much, for the most part, that's pretty much the average thing that most people will do with it, is use it for themselves or give it to their god. There's not a lot else you can really do with XP, except if you have a weapon, it's usually a magical weapon, you can dump it into there, and over time you can make those weapons more powerful. So yes, you can technically feed the weapons with XP. And then interesting connection between mortals and gods in a webcomic that they read. Let's see. Gods cannot understand mortals like mortals can understand gods. Like a bird will never understand how the mole lives. Interesting. So it's like, yeah, the mole can see the bird when they come outside and see what they're doing, but the bird really can't comprehend the little mole. Like, interesting concept where the gods are more confused about mortals than mortals are about gods. Because gods are just so far beyond. Like,
they're so far detached.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting concept for that too.
Well, how would you feel about a god that came from mortalhood? Would you say that they are the most in tune with both? Because they were once there. They were once lived that life. They once were the mole.
Some of the gods who have done that have made that argument, and that's some of the arguments they make for their followers is, what god could better serve you than one that understands where you came from? How could a god who has never known anything other than endless eternity possibly understand your value, dear follower? But me, I was born and lived during these great wars. I saw the tragedies. I suffered disease. I saw sorrow and death. I lost family. Come to me. I understand your I understand your daily trials more than any god in existence.
Your true plight.
There are gods that in High Point that do that. They literally lean into that fact, and then there are other gods who are the opposite side. They completely try to hide the fact that they were ever mortal. They basically never want to acknowledge that they're a lower tier god. Even if they've earned the right of a higher tier god, it still knocks them down a peg. And that knowledge can be dangerous. If a god doesn't know you used to be mortal, and you like we said, like a god who's always been a god and a god who ascended, you can eventually get to the same level of god, but the one that's natural will just be naturally more powerful. But not all gods know the origin of every other god. So that little bit of knowledge right there, when you're going toe to toe,
be a very importantly guarded secret.
So that because again, if you're going someone toe to toe, even if they're a couple levels below you in godhood, if they're a natural god and you're not, they could technically still be more powerful, even if they're a couple tiers below you. Now, they wouldn't, and laws and rights and everything, they would never go against you because of the rulings. But if you were to go toe to toe physically, or in the concept of godhood physically, they might actually stomp you because they're just their natural tendency for wielding the power. Kind of like what we've talked about, how wizards in High Point, the actual like Dresden wizards in High Point, can pound for pound wield magic way better than a wizard in the standard the standard D&D mage wizard. But when it comes down to the finesse, you can't beat the mages, because the mages can do anything with magic, but they just can't punch as hard. So same concept. A higher tier god who ascended might have more finesse, but they'll never punch as hard as a natural god. The natural god will just always punch harder because they're literally of the very essence of magic they're using.
So you've seen that show Sandman, right?
Mm-hmm.
You remember when the Sandman went down into, he was looking for his gear, and he went down into the underworld and met up with Lucy.
Yep.
And they had that little showdown.
Oh yeah.
That
was a great visual. That was
it was really cool.
That was finally the first time I've ever truly watched a god on god battle represented visually that I liked.
Have you ever seen No Game No Life? Because there was a scene in there that was beautiful. It's so they play this game called Word or whatever, and you just basically it's insane. I'll have to show it to you. But
I really liked the idea that a battle between gods is beyond mortal understanding, right? So I liked how they represented it, but it's the representation of it's a game of wits and mind and understanding, and less about like physical strength.
Yes.
Like it's not about.
But do they ever have? We'll say like in the animal kingdom, how certain males will like kind of puff up against each other to kind of like show dominance.
Oh yeah.
And, like, do they ever have where they showcase their physical skills?
Oh yeah.
They're like I am gonna demonstrate my prowess because I
all
need
the time.
To...
I mean, it's when you're in that tier of godhood, and when you game in that tier,
not necessarily like I'm gonna try and kill you, but like
but a lot of it is again when I say that the second tier of gaming, like that higher tier of gaming in High Point, is more dialogue and more diplomacy. That's what I'm talking about. Is everything in that tier, once you really get into like the godhood stuff and deal with the inner workings, everything is basically a show of force. Everything from knocking on your door and asking you a question to waging war on you is a show of force. And because gods have so many different layers of protections, right? Like gods basically have a no interference policy when it comes to the mortal world, which is why you need followers, you need mortals to go do things, right? You can't just go kill an entire like continent full of your rivals' followers, but you can sure as hell mass an army and give them dreams about conquering that place and having your mortals go conquer it and destroy those temples. You just can't come down with brimstone, right? That's the rules. That's how we keep balance, and that's what Zenith wanted. That's why the War of the Fallen happened. But the constant, like even with friends, gods are constantly, even with good friends, are constantly just being like, yeah, but don't mess with me. Remember that. Just remember I got this thing. Like it's just constantly because everyone's everyone's in fear and everyone's looking for their next up. Some gods don't like the mantles and the roles they hold, and they want to go after the next big god because they like their job better, right? Like the god of thunder may want to be the god of lightning, but you gotta there's a hierarchy, right? Bad example, but
is there any god that you would say is fully unbothered by everything else that's going on?
Oh, several.
That are just like, I don't care about you. I don't like, and like what I mean by that is like they are gonna do what they're gonna do, and they don't care who it pisses off. They don't care who anything. It's like, yes, the rules exist, and yeah, I'm not gonna go out of my way to break the rules, but at the same time, if the rules get in my way, fuck the rules.
Oh yeah, no, and that's why I liked coming up with the Pantheon, because I have like my key stars. I have like the main list. Like if one day we'll have to go out and I'll actually list out like the main gods of my realm. But of course, there's just other layers beyond that. But it's easier to go from the top down because obviously there's less up top. But yeah, the idea of I really like having a good mix. And this is why with second edition, this is one of the reasons where a lot of people talk down on this. And I think it's just because people don't know how to use this in game, especially with both with the honor system, and people just don't understand how to actually apply this to gameplay. But this is specifically where alignment comes into play. The biggest use that I have of alignment is when it comes to the Pantheons, because alignment is really what dictates that, exactly that. Like alignment really pushes the envelope in where I decide what gods do what things, how they interact, whether or not they care, right? The more neutral gods care less about things. The more selfish gods care even less about like depending upon their state of mind, their goals, and their alignment will fully dictate the personality of how they care and deal with other people. And yes, there are plenty that literally don't even pay attention until someone's in their way. And as far as they care, they're like, I don't even know who you are. And they're like, I've been here this whole time. Well, like, well, now you're in my way. Get out of my way or I kill you. Like, I don't have anything to bother with you, and I don't care that you've lived here for centuries. I now need to come through here, so get out of my way. Like, there are gods like that. There are gods who just go, oh, the world's burning. Must be lunch. Like, you know what I mean? Like they could just, they just piss off and don't care. Mm-hmm. And then there are others who take their jobs way too seriously. They're on the other side where they even take their jobs so seriously, they break the rules sometimes by doing other gods' jobs because they are pushing the boundaries of what is there.
If you're too slow, if you didn't do it on my timeline, then...
Yeah, or they just believe, hey, this is under my sphere of influence, and it's actually under another god, but they may not be doing as good of... You know, it's fun politics.
Not to their snuff.
But, you know, it's not the same type of gameplay. But by that time, I feel like if a player wants to do that, it's because you're looking for a different type of game. Like, right. I have Gameplay Plus so different. I don't want it to be just a much bigger rolling, like much bigger dice rolls than Mortalhood, right? It's supposed to be a whole different type of game because D&D very rarely has ever given glimpses into what a godlike gaming would be. Like, not a lot of books really even talked about what it would be like for a player to play a god. So I really wanted it to feel different than the standard D&D, but I wanted it to still make the player like High Point, because then you get to see, it's more about like learning more about the intricacies, but also getting to be a part of them, like getting to be a part of the story instead of just being a player in a town doing things for their own benefit. You finally get to be like, I can actually talk to other gods and make decisions and like
I can affect
make
things.
You change things in High Point. It's like, that's the fun about being a god, is you finally get to actively make decisions in High Point that I may not be able to tell you no. Like, you could become a god of a certain thing and be like, hey, that rule that you have, that's like my thing, right? Yeah, I don't like that rule anymore. And if it's justifiable, I won't be able to argue with you. You could change a fundamental rule in High Point if you became the god that influences it. And I wouldn't, like, that's kind of, again, all of those times where I try to add in, like, enticements. I want people to encourage to go there.
But I really feel like people that get to that level of gameplay, like, they've put in a lot of work to get there. They've put in a lot of effort to get there, and nobody wants to get there just to like
to troll,
blow everything up, to troll, to like be a.
And that's why it's fun, because by the time you're that level of veteran gamer with me, you have an invested interest in High Point, which means I can trust you to do things with High Point. And if you do want to blow everything up, good luck. Like, you still have the entire pantheon. The world's gonna fight
against you.
But that's the fun. Maybe you want to be an evil god that just wants to usurp everything. Fuck, go join the rest of them. There's plenty of them out there. But that's the fun. Now you get to go make deals with them. Now you get to go hear all the ways that I've tried to usurp my own, my own shit.
Because in order for that conflict to happen, you have to have two sides of the same coin. You have to have the opposition. So I mean,
you've already seen that High Point has a potential future without Zenith. You've already seen a High Point where Zenith was overtopped, so or toppled and usurped. So it is possible. So it's like, that doesn't have to be one of my gods. It could be one of you guys. It's not impossible. It's just that, again, Zenith is smart. He's not going to just let a mortal that basically shouldn't have existed without him ascend beyond his own power. He's not just going to let that happen. But it's not impossible. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so that's all. He knows it's not impossible. But do you think he's gonna just let all of those possibilities exist? No, he's gonna snuff out every possibility he can find. But that doesn't mean he can get them all. So you know what I mean? So you make this pantheon of gods to where, yes, you technically could become more powerful than Zenith. But the way the pantheon's really designed, it's kind of like the whole a mortal can't pump a level 5 into a level 6, just because quite literally there won't be enough time in existence of High Point for those XPs to count. It's a ratio thing. It's like, it's the decimals, how many zeros into the decimal. Mm-hmm. You don't have enough time in existence to rack it up. But that doesn't mean it's not doing something, and it doesn't mean it doesn't matter. Right? Doesn't mean it's not possible. So anyone can become more powerful than Zenith, but he's made it so nearly impossible that the way to do it is unknown. Like, he's looked at every possible way to become more powerful than him and put a roadblock in. Like, you want to become a more powerful god? Here's an entire pantheon you have to get through. Do you think any of them want to let their ladder go because you think you're going to be the one to do it? Especially when half of them want to do it?
Mm-hmm.
No one's going to, like, that's the idea, is everyone wants to do it, which is one of the reasons why he knows he's safe. If he encourages everyone to be, and if he lets everyone know anyone has the chance, it's going to make them fight each other more than they're going to fight him. Because even if they all turned against him, one of you still has to take the reins. One of you still has to be, like, maybe all of you all at once against me, but then you still have to convince all of you all at once against me. But one of you still has to be...
Nobody having any ulterior motives, everybody actually working together.
Someone still has to take up the mantle. Like, someone still has to be the one that takes it, right? So
and everyone else has to agree that that's going to be you or be whoever it's going to be.
So, again, it's that whole thing of the way that he's designed it is nothing's impossible, but it's not just going to be like, I'm just going to decide to do it and now I'm taking over. Like, no, good luck. Believe me, I've spent a lot of time protecting this, and I will protect it, but that's the fun of it, is if I just straight up said it's impossible, like, I won't, if I just straight up said I won't let it happen, then what's the fun? It encourages nobody, because why would you even try, right? And I could lie to you and say, sure, of course there's a chance, but that's not fun either, because the moment someone finds out that's a lie, it goes right back to square one. The first problem with is, why even bother? There has to be a possibility for it to be an encouragement, right? For it to be something for someone to obtain. And that's why I say, for the most part, most things in High Point aren't impossible. They just may not be obtainable. But there's a big difference between not obtainable and impossible.
Yes.
This sounds like the god of murder hobos.
Oh my goodness.
Get out of my way or I'll kill you.
That's right. It's exactly what they do, man. I'm saying, running through towns, leaving it on fire in their wake.
I'm just saying that, murder hobos are only a problem for DMs who don't know how to, like... I don't say DMs that don't know how to. DMs that don't plan for past to future, right? Like, what I mean by that is we're always planning for the end of the campaign. We're always planning for the future through the campaign, getting there.
You're heading towards an end game.
But very rarely do DMs plan for a past to future. Like, hey, I'm going to have you do this encounter. But what depends, like, how you do it, like, whether it's a severity of how you do it, do you give them a chance to let people live? But you can pre-plan depending on what happens here, of one of three outcomes that I've pre-decided, this is going to affect something later in the game. You guys don't know that. But whether you kill this NPC when given the opportunity, I'm planning now will make this other thing happen, right? I don't think a lot of DMs do that. I think a lot of DMs they have the whole storyline and they're like, okay, you're going to encounter these people, then these people, then these people. And by the time you get over here, yeah, these are all his minions, so he's going to be mad. But how often do you be like, okay, you're going to fight these people first, and if this happens, I'm going to make this guy way later down the road do this. But if this happens, this guy's going to do something completely different.
It's like you're trying to get from point A to point B, and it's like you can go this way, you can go this way, you can go this way over here.
I think that's something that I feel that could make a better gameplay, because if you're planning from past to future, if you plan things to have one or other outcomes, then you have more of that dynamic, like, wow, it makes it feel more like you can actually show the players their actions actually had consequences. Their actions led somewhere, right? Again, you putting down your, I know we've talked about this before, but it's one of the best ones that I think for your character was putting down your weapon and not picking it back up. But it wasn't just the simple, okay, we're leaving, but it was you specifically put it down and then you specifically got back on your horse. But too many specifics left one out, right? Whereas if you were just being general, like very vague the whole time, then, there's those things, right? So catching points where you're like, oh, I see what's happening here. I'm going to quickly decide an A and B scenario. And that's what I do.
Right.
Sometimes it's before the gaming session, sometimes it's in the gaming session. But when I see an opportunity for a decision that could affect later down the road, I try to quickly do like an ABC scenario situation where I'm like, okay, here's the ways that this could pan out, and here's the different reactions that's going to
and it's a lot easier to do that when you've set up a foundation that follows these logical patterns, because
Yeah.
we're pattern recognition machines. Like our brains work really well with like hitting these dominoes, especially when we fully grasp like how these dominoes fall and what cause and effect occurs. So when you're running through scenarios and you're like, hey, my group can either kill all these guards, they can either sneak past these guards, or they can create a diversion. Like all those things are going to have a significant impact. If they're all dead, then you don't have to fight them later, but it might alert some other people. If you sneak around them, they're still going to be there, but you might not have to deal with them now. Maybe nobody knows. And if you create a distraction, hey, you're going to alert everybody, but they're going to all be someplace else, and you can use that to your... So like all of these things can, again, like you said, have long-term effects. They can have immediate effects, all of that stuff.
And that's like you were saying, like let's say like the guards, for example. If you have a bunch of murder hobos and you're a DM trying to figure out like how do I stop like my murder hobos, right? Like they just all they do is kill. It's like, okay, well, you know that they're going to go against some guards, right? So in my scenario, if I know that there are a bunch of murder hobos, I'd be like, okay, are you going to kill, incapacitate, or sneak? Those are my three, because regardless of what they do, you're either going to incapacitate them, kill them, or get by them, right? Like one of those three things is going to happen. They're either going to know you're there or not, or you're going to alert them, right? If you're going to alert them, you know what's going to happen. Big fight, blah, blah, they get caught. But the other ways, basically the successfuls, right? I look at that as goes, okay, I could, if I know that they're murder hobos and I'm trying to stop them from doing it, I'll be like, okay, I'll rank quickly the scenarios from like, bad to good. So I'm like, okay, well, obviously if you kill them, that's what we don't want. So that's going to get the worst punishment. And sneaking by them, I want to encourage you guys to stop killing, so that's going to be the best one. And incapacitate's kind of somewhere in the middle. So I would quickly make something up where it's like, okay, how about this? If you kill them, you're going to have a 50-50 chance of getting caught. Like, they'll be found dead, but you will have a 50-50 chance of getting caught as the ones who did it. And if you do, and you get caught later down the road, like... prison, execution, king doesn't work with you, mission fail. Whatever you're doing is basically like you're gonna, you're trying to get the king's attention or whatever. Basically, it's gonna go way
it doesn't
wrong
work
for you.
out.
If you incapacitate them, maybe a neutral thing happens where it's like hey, well, thanks for not killing my guards, but we're not gonna work with you kind of thing. Like, I'm not gonna throw you in prison, but I can't help you. Versus if you sneak past them, maybe you actually, okay, you accomplish your mission. You got to the king, got to deliver the message, right? And that's the idea, is like, it doesn't have to be directly in like, let's say they're sneaking into the castle to get a message to the king. Killing the guards and getting the message to the king doesn't stop the win. They completed the mission. They got to the king. But what you do is you say, well, you killed the guards. Well, how long does it take the king to figure that out? The next time, maybe it's not until the next time you come back into town. But maybe the next time you come back into town, every guard, you find out that there's a warrant for you. So you come
wanted
into town,
posters everywhere with you and your people just
there
scattered everywhere, and you're like, "What the fudge happened, bro?"
Yeah, and what happened? Well, we succeeded the mission. We warned you about your daughter's kidnapping, and you killed 19 of my guards doing it. I want your head. Like, that's the idea, right? If you have murder hobos, you don't have to immediately throw the karma, stick at them and be like, bad karma, you're murder hoboing. But you can pre-plan, like, okay, if you guys are gonna murder hobo this is a situation I can make a consequence out of. And it doesn't have to be immediate, right? You don't have to Deus Ex Machina a bunch of guards coming in and immediately arresting them with no chance of survival. But you can do that thing where, yeah, you got in and out and completed the mission, but now that king is basically any territory of his, your wanted men. Like, that's you now have to travel in secret to any of these locations because you're now wanted for killing his men. Doesn't really do much about the gameplay, but it does make the role play and everything else a little bit harder. Right. Maybe there's a bounty on your head, so maybe you're more likely to get ambushed. Maybe you're more likely to get noticed, and people will give you more issues, right? Like, there's so many different ways to stop murder hobos, right? Like I think it's just, if you can see the opportunity, whether it's while you're planning your gaming session or in the moment, if you can see an opportunity where there's something you want to encourage and something you don't, pre-plan out right then and there a long-term consequence, right? Instead of a what can I do in the moment to stop them, because let's face it, when players are kind of like kids, the immediate punishment usually is pretty good, but not always. Like, players like to push the boundaries, and immediately arresting them for trying to attack a guard.
Immediate consequences are over immediately.
Yes. Whereas if they think they got away with it, and then find out later, oh, not only did we get away with it, but oh, now it's too late. Like, Like, oh, you murdered all these people and it's been 6 months. Do you think they care about why you murdered them? No, they've been having 6 months to think about, hanging you. Whereas if you murder them and immediately they catch you, maybe there's confusion, there's chaos, and you can talk your way out of it, right? Like the idea that the consequence can be later down the road and therefore justify it being more severe is a bigger, is a bigger thing to I think, or a bigger lesson for the players.
Yeah, no, that's not bad at all.
Yeah.
Cosmic asked a little bit earlier if I had seen the DM question that he had put in.
Oh, the most recent one.
That he put in the chat. Shatter.
Yes, about shatter in line of sight with spells.
That was a very interesting. When it comes to just generally, I didn't realize that when I look at the range on shatter and it says 60 feet, I thought 60 feet was like the audible range. Because, but 60 feet is like the source range.
Oh, wait, we got a new follower today.
Hey, new follower.
Stargana, thank you so much. Welcome. Thank you so much for the follow. Welcome. Just coming in at the end of the stream. Nice. Good that you got in here towards the end.
But, where was I going with that?
You were talking about the 60 feet wasn't like the audible range. It was just basically where you can center it. It's 60 feet of where like you can cast at it.
So just thinking about it, and again, not rules as written, not whatever Matt Colville's.
We try. We're trying to get a good vibe going. That's usually how Fridays are.
One of the things that I found really interesting is it's like, okay, imagine if you put this in a place that you can't see. Say you're on the other side of a door, and I want to put it out over there. It's possible, like if you allow someone to put it someplace that you can't see, it's possible that they can put it in a place that's like, imagine if you cast it and it's centered in the center of a rock. Well, who's going to hear that? Like if that's where it's centered, is the effect really going to have the full 60 or the whole 20 foot?
You guys know each
circle?
Other? Do you guys like go into other chats? Starcon knows the Peppa.
Right on.
That's awesome. That's hilarious.
That's dope.
But and so I actually had a lot of fun because my initial knee-jerk reaction is I thought this was going to be like most of the DM questions. I thought I was going to have a high point ruling different from the rules as written. But this was one of those ones that doesn't come up a lot, right? So I didn't have just a knee-jerk like automatically, I know how I'm going to respond to this one. And the more and more I read and the more I dove in, surprisingly enough, Jeremy Crawford has said nothing specifically on this. Like this one is not. Is this
really that highly of a debated topic?
It has
there's a lot of controversy.
I've had this debate with my gaming group way back in the day.
Is it specifically with Shatter, or is it just with
Shatter, but certain different spells that don't specifically say things? And it's like I typed in the Discord. What it really comes down to is it's a lot of interpretation. And I've always leaned. Originally, I always leaned with people on because it doesn't quite say it. You could justify that it says any area that you choose. Like I get why you want to lean towards any area you choose, but when you look at D&D as a whole, and I've read as many rules and as many books as we have, and looked at these things from that point of view of being DMs and having rules lawyers and things like that. There's always a consistency with how things are written, right? And what it came down to was the player's handbook page about specific over general, right? Specific beats general. If it specifically states something, it will always overrule a general rule. But the problem is when you really read it, and if you zoom out and look at every other context of spells and other abilities, a point you choose is not specific. That is not a specific. Oh my gosh, another follower. Woo. Minka Markov, thank you so much for the follower. That's two tonight. That's crazy. Both at the end of the stream. That's great.
You're partying with us.
Catchy cantrips. I finished the. Wow. Okay. Wow, you guys know each other from other streams. It's cool.
That is really cool.
But yeah, so the thing is typically when you're using the specific over general rule, it has to state something like this rule is not affected by cover, or regardless if you can see it. Like the point of your choice does not. If I were to say of your anything of your choice, you're not going to think of like if I say, hey man, you can take anything out of this room of your choice. You're not gonna be like, I'm gonna take a whale out of this room. Well, that's your choice, but there's no whale to take out.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of a point of your choice, but when you look at how spells, even ones that don't target a creature, they still, like even Fireball doesn't necessarily target a creature, but like AoE areas, the target is the center. And the way spells generally work is you need to not just know of, but you need to be able to know where you're casting. You need to see where you're casting. And a lot of the, like even Jeremy Carpenter's ruled, like spells that would otherwise go somewhere that you can't technically see will stop at the edge of where you can. So if you want to pass it on the other side of a door, it will stop. It will cast at the door's edge. That's now the new center because that's as far as you can see. So I read a bunch of these. I remember a lot of the conversations I've had, but the more I read on it, the more I agree. And I hate to, because you know me, I love playing with the rules, but realistically speaking, as the general rule applies, I really don't think that that there's a strong enough argument to say that a point of your choice is specific enough to overrule the fact that you need to see where you're casting the spell. And the balancing of that too is then what's to stop you from literally casting Shatter anywhere? I mean, you want to raid somewhere and they have a barricade, just cast Shatter on the other side of the door and everyone's dead, basically. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of the reason why you can easily see where the limitations
if you
should be.
Poke a hole in that door and you look through the door,
you see it,
then it's fine.
Totally fine.
So the way I would play that is because I do kind of agree
and
that
there's actually an argument against that too, because like you can't cast through a window. Like a window is still considered a barrier. Like someone will say, even though I'm looking through a window, you can't cast a spell on the other side of the window. It technically, rules as written, windows still act as a barrier. So it's not
rules as written.
Yeah. So even
how.
So even though you can see the location, there's still something to be said to where you have to basically like, again, line of sight it. You still have to be directly in line of it because and I don't disagree with this. So a window
doesn't count as line of sight even though you can see it?
Not for magical purposes. Not like an arrow, you're not going to have cover.
So
but for magical purposes,
if I were to cast spike growth through a window, we're saying that's not okay.
Technically, no. By rules,
even though I have line of sight on the point,
technically, they are considered like barriers.
What rule says that?
It's actually in when it talks about cover, I believe. Is it when you look at where it talks about cover?
When it talks about cover.
But yeah, wizards with so the wizards with glasses can't cast spells. So what I interpret this as is it's when you look at how spells work, right? It's not just about visual. It's not that because it's a pane of glass, but it's a physical object, I can see through it. That's just fine. Like what they mentioned, like a wizard with glasses can't cast magic. That's not what we're saying. We're not saying that because you're looking through glass, you can't see it. But it's
you're saying the magic can't get through it.
It's a combination of casting a spell. Because if you think about it, when you're casting a spell, right, you're not casting spells through the object. You're almost casting it through the object, right? This like let's say like this, right? Like so that spell we're talking about, Shatter. The Shatter spell isn't casting from me through the glass onto that point like a fireball would just crash right through it. You could make that argument, but I'm trying to start it. The origin is on the other side of a barrier. Even though I can see it, like if I were looking through a portal, should I be able to cast a magic spell on the other side of the universe because I can see through the portal even though I'm not there? Like if I can look into another plane of existence.
So I will say there's a difference between line of sight through something like a portal, because I would say line of sight through something like a portal is almost like saying you have line of sight through a TV.
Oh yeah,
that doesn't count as line of sight. And I'm not. But in the physical universe, if the point is physically that many feet away from you,
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just telling you what the rules as written is.
But even the rules as written, I'm not reading that. I'm not hearing that in its description, because when I think about what's actually happening, I think of, okay, especially because it's magic, especially because it's literally magic. Think about how you think about what you call, what is it, the wizards or the mages or whatever. They are pulling energy from a different plane of existence, right? That effect doesn't necessarily start in the origin of their physical body, right? Like, so the question is, what is it that's actually stopping you?
So I would interpret it as, I mean, again, most likely this was a oversight or just a mechanical. It was from an era where mechanically it made more sense to put those limitations. Because you're thinking about like, you're outside of a shop and you want to distract the shopkeeper with a cantrip. Why can't I be outside looking through the window and doing a cantrip to distract him? Right? That would be a justifiable. Why is the window going to stop me? I'm just doing dancing lights inside, right? Like that makes sense to justify why I should be able to cast through a window. But I think the logic, the wannabe logic for why windows stop it is because it's you're not directly connected to the point. And I'm not saying it's a good rule. I'm not saying that it makes sense, but I just do know that this has been if you look it up, a lot of people argue this a lot of the times. And this is, I believe, one of the rules, I'll have to look this up next time, but I believe this is one of the rules that a lot of people disagree with Crawford with, because I believe Crawford is on the fence that windows act as barriers. And I think a lot of people disagree with him on that one.
Okay. So let me ask you about this. Misty Step. Misty Step is a spell with a range of self.
Yeah.
And it says you teleport up to 30 feet to an unoccupied space you can see. So
I believe this is actually the one that Crawford gets the most heat on, because I'm pretty sure we'll have to look this up on a different day, but I'm pretty sure, because we're getting at the end of our stream time, but I'm pretty sure this is the one he gets debated about the most, because this is the one he came out and said Misty Step won't go through a window. I'm pretty sure this is the one that gets the most heat,
because that's not even in the range of the spell. It's the spell effect.
No, I know.
So
I know.
like, and that's
I believe me, I'm not. I get the argument. I'm just saying it's super debated.
I'm trying to.
And I think what it is because the original rule, I think, just comes from an era of an earlier D&D, but it's one of those things where it's because it's been kept so long. I think that's why it's more of it's a fundamental rule of D&D, so we're not dropping it. And I think that's why it's still debated, is because everyone knows it's dumb. Everyone knows that a window shouldn't stop magic. That it shouldn't, period. But I think my personal viewpoint is it's one of those it's not that anyone actually cares, like on the Wizards of the Coast side.
It's the lightweight, that's the way we've always done it.
It's a fundamental rule that's been here, and maybe once upon a time it was so debated that they finally put their line in the sand and now they can't go back on it. I don't know. I fully have heard all of the arguments. I can't say that I fall into the era or I fall into the side of yes, all windows should block it. I like in High Point, it's extremely situational when it would block it, but like the reasons for why it would block it, it's like the reason why I never really cared too much is because it never comes up, right? It is such a unique situation that a window is going to be blocking you to the only place you want to go. But like, I can make it make sense because, well, that means that every thief just has to learn Misty Step and there's no such thing as locks. Like, why learn, pick lock when I can just poof on any other glass? Like, I can rob any store I want because they all have glass windows. Like, you can make that argument. I've heard the argument of, again, the over abuse of it. I've also heard the argument that, again, the idea of just magic, dancing lights to play with someone on the other side of a window. Why can't I do that? What's stopping the magic? Like you said, I'm ripping magic from a whole other plane of existence. Why does it matter if it's on this side of the window or that side of the window? Like, I'm in the same room.
Does that mean with the understanding of this rule, if I had dancing lights and I bubbled them through, I cast it right next to me, and I bubbled them through the window, and I closed the door, and I was watching them through the window and moving, would that work?
That's another argument that people have made, is what if the window is closed after the spell's been cast? How does that affect concentration? These are all of the arguments that people have made over the years of it's inconsistent to say that you can't cast through a window. But I also have heard a clever argument here. The argument is, for those who allow casting through a window, And I think we'll end it with this one. We won't go
for sure.
But I'm just going to end the stream with this question. But it's clever. It's not an exact... I'm not saying that this is the end-all be-all argument, but it's a good one to end with. But one of the counter arguments, because I still think you should be able to cast most of the time through a window. I see mechanically why. But one of the arguments is, if you can cast through a window, then should I be able to cast to a place I can't see through a mirror? Like, normally you can't cast against someone behind cover, right? I can't cast a spell on you if you're fully behind cover. I just can't. I have to be able to target you. Mm-hmm. What if there's a mirror behind you?
So
that we're not gonna get into it.
Yeah,
but I'm just leaving it there.
I see.
That is the counter argument. Is if I can cast through a window, I should be able to cast through a mirror, and that technically violates rules. We're gonna leave it there. You guys decide in the comments. Let us know in the comments. Let us know in the Discord what you guys think. We will pick up this topic because I want to talk about this more.
Very interesting.
This is a cool topic, but if you can't cast through a window, you can you cast through air? Yeah. But again, that's my point. It's a hotly debated topic. It's a weird one. If you guys haven't, Google it and just watch the debate unfold in Reddit, in D&D Wiki. But no, it's a cool question because regardless of what you think about the whole window casting, the question of should you be able to cast magic to a spot you can see only via a mirror, still a good question regardless. We're going to end it there. I want to know what you guys think. Talk about it in Discord. We will bring this topic up again. Otherwise, that's going to be us. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you so much for the 2 new followers. That's fantastic. We are getting there. This is we are having such amazing growth. I think we have 4 people this year already in 2 streams. Like, second stream of 2024, off to a great start.
We are on our way to, what is it, affiliate?
Yes, we are on our way to affiliate. Thank you so much I was just about to pop that in there. But join the Discord if you guys haven't. We are live every Monday at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time with D&D Discussions Homebrew Review Edition, where we typically take a viewer-submitted item, weapon, clothing, whatever homebrew item. We review it, give it some of our own twists, kind of just talk about what we think about it, and then we'll give it a review out of 10, a point out of 10 on whether or not we would actually want to use it in our own settings. And then on Fridays, we do deep lives like this, where we take a topic and we just peel it apart and talk all freely about it. Otherwise, that's been us. Again, I hope you guys have a great week ahead, or great weekend ahead of you. I hope you had a great week. Can't wait to see you guys again on Monday for the next homebrew review. We have 5 weeks of viewer submitted items. You can submit those via the Discord if you want. So be here for that. Super excited. Thank you guys again so much. It's so cool to see such traction. Cool. That's been great. But yes, you guys have been fantastic. Thank you guys so much. We'll see you in the Discord and have a fantastic weekend.
Deuces, my friends.